Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. The summer I turned 16 began as most others had before. My parents' cabin in northern New Mexico was supposed to be our refuge, our annual escape from the relentless Arizona heat and the complexities of teenage life. But the events that unfolded during those 7 days in July 2019 transformed our peaceful retreat into something I still struggle to comprehend. I remember staring out the car window as we wound through the mountain roads, the pines growing denser with each mile. My brother Travis, 3 years my senior and infinitely more enthusiastic about these family trips, was drumming his fingers against the dashboard to some rhythm only he could hear. "Looks like we're going to have a full moon all week," my father observed, glancing at the pale ghost of the moon, visible even in daylight. "Should make for good night fishing." I merely nodded, too consumed by the petty dramas and insecurities that had plagued my sophomore year. A failed friendship with my best friend Becky, the uncomfortable awareness of my changing body, and the crushing self-consciousness that seemed to follow me everywhere. These were the true monsters I believed I was escaping. If only I'd known. Our cabin sat nestled between towering ponderosas, its weathered logs and moss-tinged roof a familiar sight that usually brought comfort. It wasn't large. 3 bedrooms, a modest kitchen with a stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch where cell reception existed only in one specific corner. My mother called it intentional disconnection, this forced digital detox. As we unloaded the SUV, I noticed how quiet the forest seemed. Usually birds called to one another. Squirrels chattered their objections to our arrival, but today there was an unusual stillness that made the hair on my arms rise. I dismissed it as imagination, helping Mom unpack groceries while Dad and Travis handled the heavier luggage. "This place hasn't changed a bit," Mom said, running her hand over the worn kitchen counter. "Remember when you were 8 and insisted there was a mountain lion under your bed?" I rolled my eyes. "I was a kid. And now you're practically grown," she said with that particular maternal sadness that suggested she wasn't entirely pleased with this development. Travis bounded in with my suitcase, dropping it unceremoniously by the staircase. "Mom, can Ivy and I go down to the river before dinner? Just to check it out?" My mother hesitated, looking at me. "If Ivy wants to." I didn't particularly want to, but the alternative was unpacking or listening to my parents reminisce about previous trips. Sure, whatever. The path to the river was well-worn, descending through stands of aspen whose leaves trembled in the faintest breeze. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted with each step. Despite my affected teenage indifference, I felt something loosen in my chest as we walked, an unwinding of the tension I'd been carrying for months. Travis moved ahead, confident and lanky, occasionally glancing back to make sure I was keeping up. He'd grown even taller over the past year, his shoulders broadening, his voice deepening into something that still sometimes surprised me when he spoke. "So, what's up with you lately?" he asked, slowing to let me catch up. "You've been weird." "I haven't been weird," I protested automatically. "Just normal teenage stuff." "Right." He nodded sagely, as if 3 years granted him vast wisdom. "Well, try to chill out this week. This might be one of our last family trips before I'm off to college, you know." The thought struck me with unexpected force. Travis had always been there, irritating, protective, immovable. The idea of him leaving created a hollow feeling I wasn't prepared for. We reached the river, its surface glinting in the late afternoon light. Travis immediately picked up stones to skip across the water, while I found a fallen log to sit on, watching the current's hypnotic flow. "Do you think there's anything in these woods?" I asked suddenly. Besides the usual wildlife, I mean. Travis paused mid-throw. Like what? I shrugged, embarrassed by the childish question. Never mind, Sasquatch. Chupacabra. The ghost of Great-Uncle Herbert? He grinned, then launched his stone. It skipped 5 times before sinking. I said never mind. I stood up, brushing off my jeans. We should head back. As we turned to leave, I heard a sound above the river's constant murmur, a sharp, clicking noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, scanning the tree line. Did you hear that? Travis was already several steps up the path. Hear what? That. Clicking sound. Probably just a woodpecker. He shrugged, unconcerned. Come on, Mom's making her famous lasagna tonight. I followed reluctantly, glancing back at the river. The strange sound had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us, something that didn't belong in these woods. That night, after dinner and an obligatory round of board games, I stepped out onto the porch alone. The moon hung enormous and luminous above the trees, bathing everything in silver light. I found the corner with cell service and tried texting Becky, more out of habit than hope for reconciliation. As I waited for the message to send, that strange stillness fell over the forest again. The night creatures, crickets, frogs, the distant hooting of owls, all went silent at once. I lowered my phone, suddenly alert, my breath clouding in the unexpectedly cool air. Then I heard it, a rushing sound overhead, like the displaced air of something large in flight. The treetops swayed, though there was no wind. My heart hammered against my ribs as I backed toward the door, my fingers fumbling for the handle. A heavy thud sounded from the edge of the clearing, followed by that clicking noise again, louder now, more purposeful. I stood paralyzed, straining to see through the darkness beyond the porch light's reach. Movement caught my eye, something large shifting between the trees. I glimpsed what looked like a massive, hunched shadow. But before I could process what I was seeing, a high-pitched, agonized squeal cut through the night. The sound was so primal, so filled with terror, that my body reacted before my mind could catch up. I burst through the door, slamming it behind me. My father looked up from his newspaper, alarmed by my sudden entrance. "Ivy, what's wrong?" I struggled to speak, my voice thin and trembling. "There's something out there." "What do you mean, something?" My father rose from his armchair, newspaper forgotten. "I don't know," I stammered, trying to organize my thoughts. I heard this weird sound, like clicking, and then there was this scream. An animal, I think. Travis muted the television. "What kind of animal?" "I don't know." "Something small?" It sounded like it was being attacked. My father's expression shifted from concern to cautious curiosity. He was a high school biology teacher, and anything related to wildlife immediately engaged his professional interest. "Could have been an owl catching a rabbit," he suggested, moving toward the door. "They make quite a commotion sometimes." "It wasn't an owl," I insisted, though I couldn't articulate why I was so certain. Dad grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight we kept by the door. "Travis, come on, let's take a look." My brother jumped up eagerly, never one to miss potential adventure. Mom emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What's happening?" "Nothing to worry about," Dad assured her. "Ivy heard something outside. We're just going to check it out." Mom looked at my pale face. "Are you okay, sweetie?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. I wanted to tell her about the massive shadow I'd glimpsed, but I knew how it would sound, like the overactive imagination she'd always attributed to me. As Dad and Travis pulled on their jackets, I blurted, "Be careful." My father smiled reassuringly. "Always am." The door closed behind them, and I stood awkwardly in the living room while Mom finished cleaning up the kitchen. The minutes stretched uncomfortably as I strained to hear anything from outside. "They've been gone a while," I said finally. Mom glanced at the clock. "It's been 10 minutes, Ivy." It felt longer. Much longer. When the door finally opened, Dad and Travis stepped inside, looking puzzled but not alarmed. "Well, something definitely had a bad night," Dad announced, removing his jacket. We found some blood on the ground near the tree line, and signs of a struggle. Probably a coyote got a rabbit or squirrel, Travis added, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. You didn't see anything else? I pressed. Nothing. Unusual? Dad and Travis exchanged glances. What exactly do you think you saw, Ivy? Dad asked carefully. I hesitated. I'm not sure. It was dark, but it was big and it moved wrong. Wrong how? Travis raised an eyebrow. I don't know. Just wrong, different. I was growing frustrated with my inability to describe what I'd glimpsed. Maybe I imagined it. The blood was real enough, Dad said. But predation is natural in these forests. Nothing to be concerned about. That night, I lay awake in my small bedroom, listening to the house settle and creak around me. Moonlight streamed through the gap in my curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. My mind kept replaying that fleeting glimpse of movement, trying to construct something recognizable from the fragments of memory. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I dreamed of flying, not the peaceful, floating sensation of typical flying dreams, but something urgent and predatory. I was hunting, scanning the ground below with senses beyond human comprehension. I could feel the air currents against membranes that weren't skin, hear vibrations that weren't sound. When I woke, my sheets were tangled around my legs, and my heart was racing. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the unsettling events of the previous night had been nothing more than imagination. Over breakfast, Dad announced his plan to take us fishing. Perfect day for it, he declared, studying the cloudless sky visible through the kitchen window. The river should be teeming. Travis was immediately enthusiastic, while I picked at my scrambled eggs with considerably less enthusiasm. Do I have to go? I asked. Fresh air and family time, Mom said, the non-negotiable tone in her voice familiar. It'll do you good. The fishing spot was about a half-mile downstream from where Travis and I had visited the day before. Dad carried his fishing gear with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it for decades, while Travis peppered him with questions about lures and techniques. I trailed behind, camera in hand, more interested in photographing the landscape than catching fish. While they set up their rods at the riverbank, I wandered along the edge of the clearing, photographing wildflowers and interesting rock formations. The forest felt different in daylight, less threatening but somehow more mysterious. Every shadow seemed to hold possibilities. I found myself looking up frequently, scanning the treetops for what birds? I couldn't articulate what I was searching for, but some instinct kept drawing my gaze upward. Ivy, come see what your brother caught. Dad's voice carried across the clearing. I turned back toward the river, where Travis was proudly displaying a decent-sized trout. As I raised my camera to capture the moment, something odd caught my attention. A series of deep gouges in the trunk of a ponderosa pine, about 9 feet up from the ground. Dad, I called. Come look at this. He approached, squinting at where I was pointing. Bear markings, he said after a moment's inspection. Though they're unusually high up. Bears don't climb that high just to claw at trees, I argued. Dad shrugged. Maybe not typically, but it happens. Could be a young male marking territory. I wasn't convinced. The gouges were deep and widely spaced, unlike any bear markings I'd seen in the nature documentaries Dad was always watching. We returned to the cabin around mid-afternoon with a respectable catch of 4 trout. Mom had spent the day baking and reading, the kind of quiet relaxation she rarely found time for at home. As Dad and Travis cleaned the fish behind the cabin, I showed Mom the photos I'd taken. These are really good, Ivy, she said, genuinely impressed. You have quite an eye. I paused on the image of the tree with the strange markings. Dad says these are from a bear, but I don't think so. Mom studied the photo. What else would it be? I hesitated, unwilling to voice the shapeless theories forming in my mind. I don't know. That evening, Uncle Brett and Aunt Denise drove up for a day visit, bringing with them a welcome change of energy. Uncle Brett was Dad's younger brother, more boisterous and less academic. He immediately challenged Travis to a fishing contest for the following day, which my brother eagerly accepted. "You ladies are welcome to join us," Uncle Brett announced with exaggerated gallantry. "Or you can stay here and do whatever it is you do." Aunt Denise rolled her eyes. "Ignore him. We can have a much better time without them." As it happened, I had a surprisingly pleasant day, helping Aunt Denise and Mom in the kitchen. Aunt Denise was showing me how to make her legendary French silk pie, a family recipe she claimed was the secret to a happy marriage. "Your Uncle Brett would walk through fire for this pie," she confided, demonstrating how to whip the filling to the perfect consistency. By late afternoon, the men returned triumphant with a decent-sized buck that Uncle Brett had shot. I watched from the kitchen window as they carried it behind the cabin to the small shed where Dad handled his infrequent hunting successes. "They're going to be insufferable now," Aunt Denise predicted, measuring vanilla extract with practiced precision. She was right. Dinner conversation revolved entirely around their hunting expedition, with Uncle Brett recounting every detail of the stalking and the shot with theatrical flourish. "Brett's a much better shot than I am," Dad admitted good-naturedly. "Always has been." "That's because you overthink everything, big brother," Uncle Brett replied. "Hunting's instinct, not science." After dinner, Dad and Uncle Brett took shovels and disappeared into the woods to bury the deer remains away from the cabin. "Don't want to attract predators," Dad explained before they left. Uncle Brett and Aunt Denise departed shortly after, promising to return for the traditional end-of-vacation barbecue later in the week. As their taillights disappeared down the gravel drive, a strange tension settled over me, a premonition I couldn't explain. That night, I dreamed again of hunting, of silent movement through darkness, of hunger that transcended ordinary need. I woke to Travis shaking my shoulder urgently. Ivy, wake up!" I blinked, disoriented. The digital clock on the nightstand read 2:17 a.m. "What?" I mumbled, pushing his hand away. "You need to see this," he whispered, his face pale in the moonlight streaming through my window. Suddenly alert, I followed him to his room across the hall. The blinds were raised, offering a clear view of the area behind the cabin, where Dad and Uncle Brett had buried the deer remains earlier. "Look," Travis whispered, pointing. At first, I saw nothing but moonlit clearing. Then movement caught my eye, something large and dark hunched over the burial site. It was digging with powerful, deliberate movements, earth flying from its efforts. "What is that?" I whispered, though some part of me already knew. "I think it's what you saw the other night," Travis replied, his voice tight. As we watched, the creature unearthed something, a portion of the deer remains, and began tearing at it with vicious efficiency. In the bright moonlight, I could make out details that sent ice through my veins. Leathery, dark skin stretched over a powerful frame, a snout-like face bent over its feast, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be folded appendages along its back that could only be wings. "We need to wake Dad," I said, unable to tear my gaze away. Travis shook his head. "It'll be gone before we can get him up and out there. We need proof." He reached for his phone on the nightstand and began recording, but the creature was too far away. The night too dark for his phone's camera to capture anything more than indistinct movement. "Try yours," he urged. My phone's camera was no better. The screen showed only darkness, where we could clearly see the creature with our naked eyes. "This is insane," Travis muttered. "It's right there." As if hearing his frustration, the creature suddenly stiffened, its head raised, snout lifting as if scenting the air. Then, with a surprisingly graceful movement for something so large, it gathered itself and leapt upward. Massive wings unfurled, catching the moonlight on their membranes as it launched into the air and disappeared over the treetops. Travis and I stood frozen, staring at the now empty clearing. The only evidence of what we'd witnessed was the disturbed earth where the creature had dug. "You believe me now?" I said. Not a question, but a statement. Travis nodded slowly. "Yeah, I believe you." Morning arrived with the harsh intrusion of reality. The events of the night seemed both more and less substantial in daylight, impossible to dismiss entirely, yet difficult to fully accept. Travis and I huddled at the kitchen table while Mom prepared breakfast, speaking in low tones. "We have to tell Dad," I insisted. Travis nodded, though his expression was troubled. "He's going to think we're crazy." "He won't believe us if we don't tell him together." When Dad entered the kitchen, yawning and rumpled from sleep, we exchanged meaningful glances. Mom set a mug of coffee in front of him, unaware of the tension between her children. "Sleep well?" she asked cheerfully. "Like a log," Dad replied, oblivious to our exchange. "Beautiful day out there." I cleared my throat. "Dad, we need to talk to you about something." He looked up, sensing the seriousness in my tone. "What's up?" Travis jumped in. "We saw something last night. Behind the cabin, where you and Uncle Brett buried the deer remains." Dad's expression shifted from sleepy contentment to focused attention. "What kind of something?" "The thing Ivy saw the first night," Travis continued. "It dug up the burial site." Dad set his coffee down slowly. "You both saw this?" We nodded in unison. "And what exactly did it look like?" I hesitated, knowing how outlandish the description would sound. "It was big," Travis said when I didn't speak. "Dark-colored, leathery skin. And it had wings." Dad blinked. "Wings, folded against its back most of the time," I added. "But it flew away when it noticed us watching." Mom had stopped cooking, spatula suspended over the skillet as she listened to our exchange. "Kids, are you sure this wasn't just shadows playing tricks?" she asked gently. "The moonlight can make ordinary things look very strange." "We know what we saw," Travis insisted, uncharacteristically firm. Dad studied our faces for a long moment. "Show me where this happened." After breakfast, the four of us walked to the burial site. The disturbance was unmistakable. Earth scattered in all directions, the shallow grave completely excavated. Dad crouched beside the hole, examining the edges with scientific detachment. "Something definitely dug here," he admitted. "But there are many nocturnal scavengers in these woods. Coyotes, foxes, even bears occasionally." "Bears don't fly, Dad," I pointed out. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "No, they don't." The rest of the day passed in a strange haze of normalcy and underlying tension. Mom suggested a hike to a nearby waterfall, clearly attempting to redirect our attention. The forest seemed particularly alive around us, birds calling, squirrels darting across our path, wildflowers nodding in the gentle breeze, as if to emphasize the natural order we were questioning. As we walked, I found myself continually scanning the treetops, watching for movement among the branches. Once I thought I glimpsed something dark shifting against the greenery, but it was gone before I could focus on it. "Looking for your flying creature?" Dad asked quietly, falling into step beside me while Mom and Travis moved ahead. I nodded, surprised by his lack of skepticism. "I want you to know I'm taking this seriously," he said. "Both of you. But I'm also considering all possible explanations." "You think we imagined it?" "No." His answer came quicker and more firmly than I expected. "I think you saw something. I'm just not jumping to conclusions about what it was." That evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Travis broached the subject that had been building in both our minds all day. "I think we should try to see it again," he announced. "Set up a proper watch tonight." Mom looked alarmed. "Absolutely not. Whatever's out there, it's wild and potentially dangerous. That's why I'll be with them," Dad said, surprising us all. He met Mom's startled gaze steadily. "If there's something unusual in these woods, I want to know what it is." "You can't be serious," Mom protested. "I am." Dad's voice was calm but firm. "I'll bring my rifle as a precaution. We'll stay on the porch, not venture into the woods. But if what they saw is real, I need to see it for myself." Mom's objections continued, but there was a determination in Dad's expression I recognized from rare occasions when his mind was truly made up. This wasn't just about humoring his children. His scientific curiosity had been genuinely piqued. As darkness fell, Dad positioned 3 chairs on the porch facing the clearing where we'd seen the creature. The rifle leaned against the railing, loaded but with the safety on. Mum had retreated to their bedroom earlier, her disapproval evident in every line of her body. "If we see anything threatening, we go inside immediately," Dad instructed. "No heroics, no attempts to interact. We observe only. Understood?" Travis and I nodded solemnly. The moon rose, nearly as full as the previous night, bathing the clearing in silver light. Nocturnal sounds surrounded us. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the gentle sigh of wind through pine needles. Hours passed with no sign of our mysterious visitor. Dad began to doze in his chair around midnight, his chin dropping to his chest before he would jerk awake again. Travis grew increasingly restless, shifting position every few minutes. "Maybe it won't come back," he whispered, disappointment evident in his voice. "Maybe it knows we're watching." I didn't respond, my eyes fixed on the tree line. Something told me patience would be rewarded. As if on cue, the forest fell suddenly silent. I stood, my movement causing Dad to fully wake and Travis to freeze mid-fidget. I pointed wordlessly toward a massive pine at the edge of the clearing. There, in its uppermost branches, something was moving. In the moonlight, I could just make out a dark shape clinging to the trunk. As we watched, it shifted position, and 2 pinpoints of reflected light, eyes, briefly caught the moonlight. "Do you see it?" I breathed. Dad stood slowly, one hand reaching for the rifle without taking his eyes from the tree. "I see something," he confirmed, his voice barely audible. The creature in the tree remained motionless, except for the occasional adjustment of its position. It seemed to be watching us as intently as we were watching it. "It's huge," Travis whispered. "Way bigger than I thought." Dad raised the rifle cautiously, not aiming, but preparing. The slight movement was enough. The creature's head swiveled sharply in our direction, those reflective eyes fixing on us with unmistakable awareness. Then, with explosive force, it launched itself from the tree. Massive wings unfurled, catching the moonlight on their membranous surface. For a breathtaking moment, it was silhouetted against the night sky, a shape unlike anything in the natural world I knew. Neither bat nor bird, but something that borrowed elements from both, while being entirely its own creation. It circled once above the clearing, a display that felt almost deliberate, before disappearing into the deeper forest with surprising speed and silence for something so large. None of us spoke for several long moments after it vanished. The forest's ambient sounds gradually returned, as if released from whatever hold the creature's presence had exerted over them. "What was that?" Travis finally asked, his voice cracking slightly. Dad lowered the rifle slowly. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know it wasn't any animal catalogued in North American wildlife guides." I felt a strange mixture of vindication and terror. The creature was real. Dad had seen it too. But that reality opened questions far more disturbing than I was prepared to confront. "We should go inside," Dad said, gathering himself. "We'll talk about this in the morning." None of us slept well that night. I lay awake for hours, replaying the image of the creature's flight against the moon, trying to make sense of what we'd witnessed. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with darkness and wings and eyes that reflected red in moonlight. The morning atmosphere was charged with a strange electricity as we gathered around the kitchen table. Mum looked from face to face, noting our expressions with growing concern. "You saw something," she stated rather than asked. Dad nodded, pouring coffee with slightly unsteady hands. "We did." "And?" she prompted when he didn't elaborate. Dad glanced at Travis and me before answering. "It was unusual, not anything I can readily identify." "It had wings, Mom," Travis interjected, unable to contain himself. "Huge wings. And it was watching us from that big pine tree." Mom's face paled slightly. "You're telling me there's some kind of giant bat living in these woods?" "I don't know what it is," Dad admitted. But it's certainly not a known bat species. The wingspan was... He paused, considering. At least 6 feet, maybe more. 7, I corrected with certainty. And it had this face. Not exactly like a bat. More pig-like, with a snout. Mom looked increasingly disturbed. Should we leave? Go back home early? The possibility hadn't occurred to me, and judging by Travis's startled expression, it hadn't crossed his mind either. Dad considered the question seriously. I don't think we're in danger, he said finally. It had ample opportunity to approach the cabin last night if it wanted to, but it kept its distance. It seems more curious than aggressive. Curious? Mom echoed incredulously. Michael, if what you're describing is real, it's not some woodland creature being curious. It's something that shouldn't exist. Dad raised his hands placatingly. I understand your concern. But scientifically speaking, new species are discovered every year. Remote areas like these mountains could conceivably harbor unknown wildlife. New species of insects, maybe, Mom countered. Not giant flying mammals. Actually, Travis interrupted, his expression lighting with sudden realization, what if it's not a mammal at all? What if it's more like a pterosaur? Dad shook his head. Pterosaurs have been extinct for 66 million years, Travis. So we're told, Travis persisted. But there are stories about thunderbirds and other giant flying creatures from indigenous cultures all over these regions. What if they're based on actual sightings? I considered his theory. It didn't look like the pterosaurs in books, I pointed out. No crest, and the proportions were different. Convergent evolution, then, Travis argued. Something that evolved along similar lines, but independently. Dad's expression was a mixture of professional skepticism and paternal pride at Travis's reasoning. It's an interesting hypothesis, but without more evidence, we could get evidence, Travis suggested eagerly. Set up a camera trap or... No, Mom interrupted firmly. Absolutely not. I don't want either of you deliberately trying to attract this. Whatever it is. What about just documenting it if we happen to see it again, I asked. Our phones didn't work last night because it was too dark, but maybe in better light. Dad considered this. Passive observation only, he conceded. No attempts to bait or attract it, and no going into the woods alone, especially after dark. Mom didn't look entirely satisfied with this compromise, but she didn't object further. After breakfast, Dad retreated to the living room with his laptop, searching for any records of unusual wildlife sightings in the region. Travis joined him, while I helped Mom clean up the kitchen. You really saw something, didn't you? She asked quietly as we worked side by side at the sink. I nodded. It was incredible, Mom, terrifying, but amazing too. She studied my face for a moment. Just be careful. All of you. I know your father and brother get caught up in the excitement of discovery, but some things are better left undisturbed. The warning sent a chill through me, though I couldn't articulate why. Later that afternoon, Dad and Travis announced they were going to check the burial site again, to see if there were any tracks or other evidence in daylight. Mom insisted on accompanying them, unwilling to let them out of her sight after the previous night's encounter. I stayed behind, claiming a headache. In truth, I wanted some time alone to process what we'd seen and what it might mean. I sat on the porch, sketchbook in hand, trying to capture the creature from memory. My artistic skills were modest at best, but the act of drawing helped solidify the details in my mind, the leathery texture of its wings, the strange proportions of its body, the eerie intelligence in those reflective eyes. As I sketched, a shadow passed over the porch briefly, too briefly for me to look up and identify its source. A cloud crossing the sun, perhaps, or a large bird. But something in the quality of the momentary darkness raised the hairs on my arms. The rest of the day passed without incident. Dad and the others returned from their expedition with little to report. The burial site showed signs of continued disturbance, but the ground was too rocky for distinct footprints. Travis had collected some dark, bristly hairs caught on a nearby tree branch that Dad examined under his pocket magnifier with great interest. Not bear, he concluded. Not elk or deer either. The structure is unusual, almost like pig bristles, but coarser. Dinner conversation revolved around theories and possibilities, with Travis championing his living fossil hypothesis, while Dad suggested more conservative explanations involving known but rare species. Mum remained skeptical of all theories, maintaining that we might have collectively misinterpreted what we'd seen. Stress and suggestion can be powerful influences on perception, she reminded us, drawing on her background in psychology, especially in low-light conditions. We all saw the same thing, Mom, Travis argued. At the same time. That's not suggestion. The debate continued as we cleared the table and settled in the living room for our traditional evening board games. Tonight's selection was Scrabble, which typically brought out Dad's competitive side. But he seemed distracted, his plays uncharacteristically mediocre as his gaze drifted repeatedly to the darkened windows. Just as Mom was tallying the final scores, a rare victory for her, a sound from outside caught our collective attention, a sharp, staccato clicking that seemed to move around the perimeter of the cabin. We froze, the game forgotten. The clicking paused, then resumed at a different point, as if the source was circling us. "It's back," Travis whispered unnecessarily. Dad rose slowly, moving toward the window. Mom caught his arm. "Don't!" she pleaded. "Just let it go." He hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. Before he could decide, the clicking stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then came a new sound, a soft scratching against the cabin's wooden exterior, directly outside the living room wall. It moved upward, as if something was climbing the side of the structure. "The roof," I breathed. Dad's eyes widened as the implication registered. He crossed quickly to the fireplace and removed the hunting rifle from its rack above the mantel. "Everyone stay here," he instructed, checking that the weapon was loaded. "Michael, no!" Mom protested, rising from her chair. "I'm just going to the porch," he assured her. "I won't confront it, but I need to see what we're dealing with." Before she could argue further, he moved to the front door and stepped outside, closing it firmly behind him. The three of us remaining inside stood in tense silence, straining to hear anything from outside. Seconds stretched into minutes with no sound except our own shallow breathing. When the door finally reopened, Dad's expression was unreadable. "It's gone now," he said simply, "but it was definitely on the roof. I saw it fly off when I came out." "Did you get a better look at it?" Travis asked eagerly. Dad shook his head. "Just the silhouette against the moon." "Same as before." Mom sank back into her chair, visibly shaken. "This isn't right," she murmured. "We should leave tomorrow." "Catherine." Dad's voice was gentle but firm as he set the rifle aside and knelt beside her chair. "We're not in danger. It's curious about us, that's all. If it meant harm, it would have shown aggression by now." "You don't know that," she argued. "You're a biology teacher, Michael, not a cryptozoologist. You have no idea what this thing wants or what it might do." The term cryptozoologist seemed to amuse Dad despite the tension. "No, I suppose I don't, but I do know it's been around since we arrived and it hasn't harmed any of us." Travis cleared his throat. "I think we should set up a watch again tonight, but this time, let's be better prepared." Mom's objection was immediate. "Absolutely not. We just established we have no idea what this creature is or what it wants." "That's exactly why we need to observe it," Travis countered. "How else will we learn?" I could see the conflict in Dad's expression, scientific curiosity battling parental caution. Finally, he sighed. "I agree with Travis, but with stricter safety measures. We stay inside, lights off, watching from the windows. No one goes outside under any circumstances." Mom looked from face to face, recognizing she was outvoted. "This is insanity," she murmured, but didn't argue further. The rest of the evening passed in tense preparation. Dad checked and rechecked the doors and windows, while Travis gathered every flashlight in the cabin. I was tasked with setting up Dad's video camera on a tripod facing the clearing, our best chance for documentation if our phones failed again. When everything was ready, we settled into our observation posts. Mom and Dad took the living room windows, while Travis and I positioned ourselves in our respective bedrooms upstairs, each with a view of different parts of the surrounding forest. The moon rose, impossibly bright and seemingly larger than previous nights. Its silver light transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and mysterious. I sat cross-legged on my bed, peering through a narrow opening in the curtains, camera ready beside me. Hours passed with no sign of our nocturnal visitor. My eyelids grew heavy, despite my determination to remain alert. I jerked awake from an unintended doze to find the forest exactly as it had been, undisturbed and silent. Then, as midnight approached, I noticed a change. The ambient sounds of the forest, insects, distant owls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, gradually diminished until an unnatural silence enveloped the cabin. I straightened, instantly alert. Movement at the edge of my field of vision drew my attention to a massive pine about 50 yards from the cabin. Something large was descending its trunk, moving with surprising grace for its size. In the moonlight, I could make out the now familiar silhouette, the hunched body, the folded wings, the strange, elongated head, my heart hammering. I reached for the walkie-talkie Dad had given each of us. "It's here," I whispered. "Northeast corner, big pine tree." Static crackled, then Travis's excited voice. "I see it too. It's coming down the tree." "Stay where you are," Dad's voice cautioned. "Keep watching." The creature reached the ground and paused, head swiveling as if surveying its surroundings. Then, with deliberate movements, it began to approach the cabin. My mouth went dry as I watched its advance. Its gait was peculiar, a kind of loping movement that seemed almost awkward, until I realized it was designed for creatures that spent more time in the air than on the ground. Despite this awkwardness, it covered ground quickly. "It's coming toward the cabin," I reported, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm getting the camera," Travis announced, and I heard his footsteps hurrying down the hall. The creature paused at the edge of the cleared area around the cabin, as if hesitant to leave the cover of the trees. In the open moonlight, I could see it more clearly than ever before, the leathery skin stretched over a powerful frame, the enormous folded wings that formed a kind of caped silhouette, the elongated head with its pig-like snout. But most disturbing were the eyes, large, forward-facing, and reflecting the moonlight with an eerie red glow that suggested intelligence far beyond that of ordinary wildlife. As I watched, frozen in a mixture of terror and fascination, the creature's head tilted upward. It was looking directly at my window. Our gazes locked across the distance, and in that moment I felt something pass between us, a recognition, an acknowledgement. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. There was purpose in those eyes, calculation, an awareness that left me breathless. The creature's mouth opened slightly, revealing rows of small, sharp teeth that glinted in the moonlight. Not the fangs of a predator like a wolf or bear, but something more akin to a primate's dentition, omnivorous, adaptable. Then, with shocking suddenness, Travis's bedroom light flicked on down the hall. The harsh electric glare spilled from his window onto the clearing, catching the creature in its beam. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The creature reared back, wings partially extending in what appeared to be a defensive posture. A high-pitched, keening sound cut through the night. Not quite a screech, not quite a wail, but something uniquely unsettling that raised every hair on my body. In one fluid motion, it launched itself skyward, powerful wings beating the air as it shot upward and away from the light. Within seconds, it had disappeared over the tree line, leaving only that strange cry echoing in the sudden silence. "Travis!" Dad's voice came through the walkie-talkie, tight with anger. "What happened to staying dark? I was trying to get better light for the camera." Travis defended himself. "Did you see it? Did anyone get footage?" I realized I had completely forgotten about my camera in the intensity of the moment. It sat unused beside me, a reminder of how thoroughly the creature had captured my attention. "It was looking right at me," I said softly into the walkie-talkie. "Right at my window. It knew I was here." A pause, then Dad's voice, gentler now. "Come downstairs, both of you. We need to talk." We gathered in the living room, the normal cheeriness of the space at odds with the tension vibrating between us. Mom sat rigid on the edge of the sofa, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Dad paced by the fireplace, his scientific demeanor barely containing his excitement. Travis perched on the armrest, disappointment evident in his slumped shoulders over his failed recording attempt. "Let's establish what we know," Dad began, slipping into his classroom voice. "We've all now seen this creature. It's large, winged, and unlike any documented species in North America. It's intelligent," I added. "The way it was watching us, especially me tonight, it wasn't just animal curiosity. It was studying us." Mom shivered visibly. "That's not comforting, Ivy." "No," Dad agreed, "but it's significant. If this is an undiscovered species, its apparent intelligence makes it even more remarkable." "So what do we do?" Travis asked. "Try again tomorrow night? Maybe set up some kind of bait?" "No bait," Mom interjected firmly. "I won't have you actively trying to attract this thing closer to us." Dad nodded. "I agree with your mother on that point. We observe only from inside the cabin, and—" He hesitated, glancing at Mom. "I think we should consider contacting someone." "Like who?" Travis asked. "I have a colleague at the university who specializes in unusual wildlife sightings, Dr. Harriet Weiss. She's respected in her field, not some fringe cryptozoologist. If anyone would take this seriously without sensationalizing it, it's her." Mom looked skeptical. "And how exactly do you plan to contact her?" "The landline is for emergencies only, and cell service is practically non-existent. We could drive into town tomorrow," Dad suggested. "Use the phone at the general store." "And say what?" Mom challenged. "That we've discovered a monster in the woods? They'll think we're crazy." "Not if we present it properly," Dad countered. "As a potential unknown species, described in scientific terms." The debate continued, the familiar rhythm of their disagreements strangely comforting amid the extraordinary circumstances. Travis and I exchanged glances, recognizing that this was ultimately the adults' decision. When they finally reached a compromise, Dad would go into town alone the next day to make a discreet inquiry to his colleague. We were dismissed, to bed with strict instructions, to keep our curtains closed and not to attempt any solo observation. Back in my room, I found myself too wired to sleep. The memory of those intelligent eyes meeting mine kept replaying in my mind. I pulled out my sketchbook again, trying to capture what I'd seen with greater accuracy, now that I had a clearer image to work from. As I drew, a strange sensation crept over me, a feeling of being observed despite my closed curtains. I paused, pencil hovering over the page, listening intently. Nothing. Yet the feeling persisted, an awareness that prickled along my skin and raised the fine hairs on my arms. Slowly, I rose from my bed and approached the window. Logic told me to leave the curtains closed as instructed, but something stronger than logic drew my hand forward. I parted the curtains a fraction of an inch, just enough to peer out with one eye. The moonlit forest appeared empty and still. I was about to step back when movement directly across from my window caught my attention. There, perched on a branch of the nearest pine, not 30 feet from the cabin, was the creature. It clung to the tree with powerful limbs, wings folded tightly against its body, head turned directly toward my window. Even through the tiny gap in my curtains, I could see those eyes fixed on mine. I froze, unable to move or call out. The creature made no aggressive movement, no sound. It simply watched me watching it. An eerie tableau held in the silver light of the moon. Then, with deliberate slowness, it raised one clawed limb and pressed it against the trunk of the tree, scoring deep gouges in the bark, identical to the marks I'd photographed days earlier. The message seemed unmistakable. I marked my territory. I claimed this place. I let the curtain fall back into place, heart thundering in my chest. I backed away from the window, colliding with my nightstand and sending my lamp crashing to the floor. Footsteps pounded down the hall, and my door flew open to reveal Dad, rifle in hand. "What happened? Are you all right?" "It's outside my window," I managed, pointing with a shaking hand. "Right outside, in the tree." Dad crossed to the window and carefully peered through the curtains. After a long moment, he let them fall closed. "It's gone now," he said, turning to face me. His expression was troubled. "But there are fresh claw marks on that pine, just as you described." Travis appeared in the doorway, followed by Mom, both looking alarmed. "Did you see it?" Travis asked eagerly. Dad nodded slowly. "Just glimpsed it moving away. But the marks it left—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "What?" Mom prompted. "They're deliberate," Dad said. "Methodical. Not the random scoring of an animal marking territory or sharpening claws. Almost like writing," I finished for him. "Like it was leaving a message." The implication hung heavy in the air between us. "That's anthropomorphizing," Mom objected, though her voice lacked conviction. "Animals don't leave messages. Not animals as we typically understand them, no," Dad agreed. "But if this creature possesses intelligence comparable to, say, higher primates or cetaceans or humans," Travis suggested quietly. None of us responded to that. The possibility was too disturbing to acknowledge directly. "No one sleeps alone tonight," Dad decided. "Ivy, you'll stay with your mother in our room. Travis, you're with me in the living room. We'll take shifts keeping watch." No one argued with this arrangement. The creature's focused interest in my window had changed something fundamental about our situation. What had begun as a fascinating wildlife mystery had shifted into something more ominous, a deliberate interaction with an unknown entity whose intentions we could not begin to comprehend. As I gathered my pillow and blanket to move to my parents' room, I glanced back at my sketchbook, still open to my most recent drawing of the creature. In the dim light, the graphite lines seemed to shift and move, the drawn eyes taking on a lifelike gleam that sent a chill through me. I closed the book firmly before following Mom down the hall. Dawn arrived with a welcome sense of normality, sunlight streaming through windows, birds calling to one another in the surrounding forest, the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. The nighttime vigil had passed without further incident, though none of us had slept deeply. Dad announced over breakfast that he would drive into town as planned to contact his colleague. Mom, initially adamant about accompanying him, was persuaded to remain at the cabin with Travis and me after Dad pointed out that leaving us alone might be more dangerous given the creature's apparent interest. "Keep the doors locked," Dad instructed as he prepared to leave. "Stay inside, stay together. I'll be back by early afternoon at the latest." Mom nodded tightly, her expression betraying her unease. Travis and I exchanged glances, recognizing the responsibility that had been placed on us to keep our surveillance discreet and not further alarm her. After Dad's departure, the cabin felt smaller somehow, more vulnerable. Mom busied herself with cleaning and organizing, her usual response to stress. Travis parked himself by the living room window with Dad's binoculars. Scanning the tree line with methodical patience, I retreated to the kitchen table with my sketchbook, adding details to my drawings based on the previous night's closer observation. The creature's anatomy fascinated me, the unique combination of features that defied easy classification. The wings resembled those of bats in their membranous structure, but were proportionally different, designed for power rather than agility. The body was muscular but lean, built for endurance rather than burst speed, and always, in every sketch, those eyes, too intelligent, too aware to belong to a mere animal. "That's really good," Mom commented, pausing behind me to study my drawing. "You've captured a lot of detail." I looked up, surprised by both her presence and her calm assessment. "You believe us now? About what it looks like?" She sighed, pulling out a chair to sit beside me. "I believe you're all seeing something. And given that 3 people I trust are describing the same features independently," she trailed off, shrugging. It's harder to dismiss as imagination or misperception. It's real, Mom, I said quietly. And it's different, special. That's what worries me, she admitted. Special things tend to attract attention. If word gets out about this creature, the implication was clear. Discovery would mean exposure, study, perhaps capture or worse. Despite my fear of the creature, the thought of it being hunted or caged created an unexpected pang of distress. Maybe Dad's colleague will know how to approach this responsibly, I suggested. Mom nodded, though she didn't look convinced. Maybe. The hours of Dad's absence stretched interminably. Travis eventually abandoned his window vigil to join us at the kitchen table, where we played card games to pass the time. The normalcy of the activity felt surreal against the backdrop of our extraordinary situation. When we finally heard the crunch of tires on gravel around 2 o'clock, the collective relief was palpable. Dad entered looking both excited and troubled, an unusual combination that immediately put us on alert. What happened? Mom asked as soon as he stepped through the door. Dad set his keys on the counter, gathering his thoughts. I spoke with Harriet, Dr. Weiss. She was intrigued by my description, though understandably skeptical without evidence. Did she know what it might be? Travis pressed. Not specifically, no. But she mentioned something interesting. Dad paused, his expression growing more serious. There have been reports over the years from this region, unverified sightings of large flying creatures that don't match known species. Most were dismissed as exaggeration or misidentification of eagles or condors in poor light conditions. But she thinks there might be something to them now, I asked. Dad nodded slowly. She's open to the possibility. Enough that she's willing to drive up here later this week to investigate personally. She's coming here? Mum's voice rose in alarm. Michael, we agreed to a discreet inquiry, not inviting researchers to our doorstep. Harriet is discreet, Dad assured her. She understands the importance of verification before any formal announcement. She's coming alone, not with a team. Mom didn't look reassured. And if she confirms your discovery? What then? Dad hesitated. That would depend on what exactly we're dealing with. If it's an undocumented but natural species, there are protocols for scientific documentation that protect both the animal and its habitat. And if it's not a natural species, Mom challenged, if it's something else entirely? The question hung in the air, none of us willing to articulate the possibilities that implied. One step at a time, Dad said finally. Harriet won't arrive until Thursday. That gives us 3 more nights to observe and document as much as we can. Mom opened her mouth to object, then closed it again, recognizing the determination in Dad's expression. This was no longer just about satisfying curiosity. It had become a scientific mission, something that spoke to the core of his identity as an educator and naturalist. Fine, she conceded, but we established strict safety protocols. No one goes outside after dark under any circumstances. We observe from inside only, all windows and doors secured. Dad nodded agreement. Absolutely. And, Mom added, her voice dropping slightly, if at any point this thing shows aggressive behavior, any at all, we leave immediately. No debate, no further observation. We pack up and go home. That's fair, Dad acknowledged. The tension in the room eased somewhat with this compromise established. Dad shared more details about his conversation with Dr. Weiss, including her suggestions for documentation methods that might prove more effective than our previous attempts. She thinks infrared might work better than standard photography, he explained. The creature's body heat should show up clearly against the cooler forest background, even in low light. Do we have infrared cameras? Travis asked skeptically. No, but there's an app for your phone that simulates the effect. Not as good as professional equipment, but better than nothing. As Dad and Travis became absorbed in the technical aspects of our observation plan, I found myself drifting to the window, gazing out at the sun-dappled forest. In daylight, it was hard to reconcile the peaceful scene before me with the eerie, moonlit world where our nocturnal visitor moved so freely. Something nagged at the edge of my consciousness, a connection I was failing to make, a pattern I couldn't quite discern. The creature's behavior toward us, particularly its focus on my window, suggested purpose beyond mere curiosity or territorial display. "It wants something," I murmured, more to myself than to the others. "What did you say, Ivy?" Dad called from across the room. I turned back to face my family. "The creature, it wants something from us, or from me specifically. The way it watches, the tree markings outside my window. It's trying to communicate." Mom looked alarmed, but Dad's expression turned thoughtful. "If it possesses the intelligence we suspect," he said slowly, "communication isn't out of the question, though what form that might take, or what it might want to communicate." He shook his head at a loss. "Maybe it's trying to warn us off," Travis suggested, "telling us to leave its territory. Then why not show aggression?" I countered. "It's had plenty of opportunities to threaten or attack, but it hasn't. It just watches, observes." "Like we're observing it," Dad noted. "Maybe that's the common ground, mutual curiosity." The idea was simultaneously comforting and unsettling. If the creature was studying us as we studied it, what conclusions was it drawing? What did it make of our strange behaviors, our technology, our structures? And what would happen when its curiosity was satisfied? The remainder of the day passed in preparation for another night of observation. Dad set up his video camera on a tripod facing the window with the best view of the clearing, while Travis downloaded the infrared app Dr. Weiss had recommended to all our phones. Mom, still visibly uneasy but resigned to our plan, prepared a hearty dinner to sustain us through the long night ahead. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cabin's interior, a strange tension built within me. The anticipation of seeing the creature again mingled with an inexplicable sense of inevitability, as if we were approaching some threshold beyond which nothing would remain the same. We positioned ourselves at various windows around the cabin, each with a different field of view. Dad took the living room with its panoramic vista of the clearing. Travis stationed himself in the kitchen, which overlooked the area where we'd buried the deer remains. Mom reluctantly agreed to watch from their bedroom window, which faced the densest part of the surrounding forest. I returned to my room, drawn irresistibly to the window where the creature had made its most direct contact. The fresh claw marks on the pine outside were clearly visible in the fading light, a reminder that our interaction was real, not imagined. As darkness fell completely and the moon rose, we maintained communication through the walkie-talkies, checking in periodically with quiet updates of all clear or nothing yet. The forest sounds followed their now familiar pattern, active and varied at first, then gradually diminishing as the night deepened. By midnight, the expected hush had fallen over the woods. I sat cross-legged on my bed, eyes fixed on the gap between my curtains, every sense alert for the creature's arrival. The walkie-talkie beside me crackled periodically with the others' reports, but so far no one had spotted anything unusual. Then, at approximately 12:45 a.m., according to the glowing digits of my bedside clock, the forest fell completely silent. The transformation was so sudden and complete that it felt as if someone had thrown a switch, cutting off all ambient sound. I reached for the walkie-talkie. "It's coming," I whispered, not needing to explain further. "Roger that," Dad's voice responded, equally hushed. "Everyone stay alert, cameras ready." I positioned my phone with the infrared app active, aiming it through the gap in my curtains. The screen showed the night landscape in eerie, false colors, cooler objects in blues and purples, warmer elements in yellows and reds. Movement at the edge of the frame caught my attention. Something warm, a glowing yellow-orange shape was moving among the trees. I adjusted my position slightly to center it on the screen. The creature emerged from the tree line with that same deliberate gait I'd observed before. On the infrared screen, its body blazed with heat, particularly the core torso and head regions. The wings, when they occasionally extended slightly for balance, showed cooler at their edges, a fascinating physiological detail that my mind filed away automatically. Visual confirmed, I reported quietly. Northeast quadrant, moving toward the cabin. I see it too, Dad responded. Travis, are you getting this? Affirmative, my brother whispered excitedly. Infrared is working perfectly. The creature paused at the edge of the clearing, its head swiveling as it surveyed the cabin. Even through the infrared filter, I could see the intelligence in its movements, the calculated assessment, the purposeful observation. Then, with startling directness, it began moving straight toward my window. My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to remain still, continuing to record as it approached. Through the infrared app, I could see details I'd missed before, the complex articulation of its wing joints, the powerful musculature of its limbs, the unusual structure of its elongated skull. It stopped directly beneath the pine tree it had marked the previous night, perhaps 15 feet from my window. For several long moments, it simply stood there, head tilted upward, those reflective eyes fixed on my position with unnerving accuracy despite the curtains between us. Then, with deliberate slowness, it raised one clawed limb and pressed it against the trunk, creating new marks alongside the previous ones. The motion was precise, controlled, not the instinctive scratching of a territorial animal, but the calculated gesture of a being with intent. It's marking the tree again, I reported, my voice barely audible. Can you see what kind of pattern it's making? Dad asked. I squinted at the screen, trying to discern any structure in the markings. It's not random. There's spacing, grouping, almost like... Before I could complete the thought, the creature did something unexpected. It turned away from the tree and lowered its body to the ground in a crouched position. With one clawed appendage, it began to draw in the soft earth at the base of the pine. I zoomed in with my phone camera, heart pounding as I tried to make out what it was creating. The low resolution of the infrared app made the details difficult to discern, but I could see that it was making deliberate patterns, lines and curves that it smoothed and adjusted with surprising dexterity. It's drawing something, I whispered into the walkie-talkie. In the dirt beneath the tree. Drawing? Dad's voice carried both skepticism and excitement. Can you make out what? Not clearly, I admitted. But it's not random scratching. It's... I trailed off as the creature finished its work and stepped back, head tilting, as if to assess its creation from a different angle. Then it looked directly up at my window again and made a series of those clicking sounds we'd heard before. Rhythmic, patterned, almost like speech, but unlike any language I'd ever heard. A chill ran through me as recognition dawned. It's trying to communicate, I breathed. The markings, the drawing, the sounds, it's all deliberate communication. For several long moments, the creature remained in place, as if waiting for a response. When none came, it repeated the sequence of clicks, louder this time, more insistent. What should I do? I asked, suddenly uncertain. Don't engage, Mom's voice cut in sharply. We don't know what it wants or what might provoke it, but it's clearly trying to establish contact, Dad countered. This could be unprecedented, direct communication with an unknown species. As they debated, I felt a strange compulsion building within me, an inexplicable certainty that this moment was meant for me specifically, that the creature had chosen me as its point of contact for reasons I couldn't yet understand. Before I could second-guess myself, I reached out and switched on my bedside lamp. The sudden illumination cast a beam of light through the gap in my curtains, creating a narrow golden path that extended to where the creature stood. It didn't flinch or retreat as it had from Travis's light the previous night. Instead, it seemed to regard the beam with what I could only interpret as satisfaction. Ivy. Arm's alarmed voice came through the walkie-talkie. What are you doing? I didn't respond. My attention fixed wholly on the creature as it raised one limb and deliberately placed it in the beam of light, as if testing its properties. After a moment's examination, it withdrew the limb and looked up again at my window, head tilted in what appeared to be expectation. It wants me to see what it drew, I realized suddenly. It needs more light to show me. Without fully processing the potential consequences, I moved to the window and opened the curtains completely, allowing the full illumination from my lamp to spill out into the night. The creature's drawing was now clearly visible in the pool of light at the base of the tree, a series of interconnected circles and lines that at first appeared abstract, but gradually resolved into a recognizable shape as my eyes adjusted. It was a crude but unmistakable depiction of the night sky, with a prominent full moon and what appeared to be a constellation. Below this celestial map was another shape that took me a moment to identify, a simplified rendering of a winged figure in flight. "Dad," I whispered into the walkie-talkie. "You need to see this. I'm coming up," he responded immediately. "Travis, stay where you are. Catherine, keep watching your sector." I heard Dad's footsteps on the stairs, then in the hallway. When he appeared in my doorway, his expression was a mixture of concern and intense curiosity. "Be careful," he cautioned as he approached the window. "Don't make any sudden movements." We stood side by side, gazing out at the creature and its creation. Dad drew in a sharp breath as he registered what he was seeing. "It's a sky map," he murmured. "And that constellation, I think it's Cygnus, the swan. What does it mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Before Dad could respond, the creature moved again. It pointed one limb toward its drawing, then extended the same limb upward toward the actual night sky, where the full moon shone brilliantly overhead. The gesture was unmistakably demonstrative, connecting its depiction to the reality above. "It's showing us something about the moon," Dad whispered, "or its connection to the moon." The creature lowered its limb and fixed those reflective eyes on us again. It made another series of clicks, these arranged in a different pattern from before, shorter, more staccato. Then, with a suddenness that made us both step back, it spread its wings to their full impressive span. The membranes caught the light from my lamp, revealing intricate networks of veins and subtle coloration that had been invisible in darkness. With a powerful downstroke that sent dust swirling from the forest floor, it launched itself upward. But instead of disappearing into the trees as before, it circled the clearing once, twice, 3 times, each circuit bringing it closer to my window. "Ivy, step back," Dad urged, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. I complied, but kept my eyes fixed on the creature as it completed its final circle and hovered, actually hovered, directly outside my window, not 10 feet away. The wing beats were nearly silent, a remarkable feat of evolutionary engineering for something so large. At this distance, I could see every detail of its face, the leathery skin stretched over a bone structure both alien and oddly familiar, the nostrils that flared at the end of its elongated snout, the eyes that regarded us with undeniable recognition and intention. It raised one limb and pressed it against the glass of my window. The gesture was so unexpected, so human in its simplicity, that I gasped. Without thinking, I moved forward and placed my palm against the glass opposite the creature's limb, a spontaneous response to what felt, in that moment, like a universal gesture of connection. Dad didn't stop me. He stood frozen, watching this impossible interaction with wide, scientific eyes that couldn't quite process what they were witnessing. For several heartbeats, the creature and I remained connected through the barrier of glass, its clawed appendage mirroring my smaller human hand. I felt something in that contact, not physically, but a kind of recognition that transcended species and logic. Then, with a final series of clicks that seemed almost like a farewell, it pulled away from the window, wings beating powerfully as it rose into the night sky. We watched as it climbed higher and higher, until it was silhouetted briefly against the full moon, before disappearing into the darkness beyond. The forest remained silent for several long moments after its departure. Then gradually, the normal nighttime sounds resumed, crickets chirping, An owl hooting in the distance, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Dad and I stood motionless at the window, struggling to process what we had just experienced. "Dad!" I finally whispered. "What just happened?" He shook his head slowly, his scientific certainty shaken to its core. "I don't know, Ivy, but whatever that creature is, it's far more than just an undiscovered species." The walkie-talkie crackled, breaking the spell of the moment. "Michael? Ivy?" Mom's voice was tight with anxiety. "What's going on up there?" Dad raised the device to his lips. "We're fine." "It's gone now." "Did you see what it drew?" Travis's excited voice cut in. I could barely make it out from my position. "Yes," Dad replied, his voice steady, despite the extraordinary circumstances. "We saw it. Everyone meet in the living room. We need to talk." The living room felt too ordinary, too normal for the conversation we were about to have. We gathered there like shell-shock survivors of some natural disaster, each of us trying to reconcile what we'd witnessed with our understanding of reality. "Start from the beginning," Mom said, her psychologist's training evident in the careful neutrality of her tone. "What exactly did you see?" Dad and I exchanged glances, silently negotiating who would speak first. I nodded for him to begin, knowing his scientific perspective would provide a framework for my more intuitive impressions. "The creature created what appears to be a star chart," Dad explained, his educator's voice slightly steadier than his hands. "Specifically, it depicted the full moon and what I believe is the Cygnus constellation, the swan. It also drew itself," I added. "A winged figure in flight beneath the celestial bodies." Travis leaned forward intently, "So it's showing its connection to the moon. Maybe explaining why it's more active during full moons?" Possibly," Dad acknowledged. "But there seemed to be particular emphasis on the Cygnus constellation, which is interesting for several reasons." "Such as?" Mum prompted when he paused. "Cygnus is associated with flight in multiple mythologies, for obvious reasons. In Greek mythology, it represents Zeus in swan form. In some Native American traditions, it's seen as a bird flying down the Milky Way. But this isn't a bird," Travis pointed out. "It's more bat-like." "In form, yes," Dad agreed. "But perhaps not in origin or evolution." Mom frowned. "What are you suggesting, Michael?" Dad hesitated, clearly reluctant to voice the speculation forming in his mind. "I'm not suggesting anything definitive, just noting that its attempt to communicate involves celestial references, which is unusual for a purely terrestrial species. The implication hung in the air, too extraordinary to address directly, but impossible to ignore completely." "There's something else," I said into the tense silence. "When it touched the window, when I put my hand against the glass, I felt something." "Felt what?" Mom asked, her expression concerned. I struggled to articulate the sensation. Not physically. "More like a recognition, a connection, as if it was trying to convey something directly mind to mind." Mom's frown deepened. "Ivy, I saw it too," Dad interrupted quietly. "The deliberateness of the gesture, the way it held contact. This wasn't random animal behavior." Mom looked from Dad to me, her skepticism battling with trust in our testimony. "You're suggesting some form of telepathic communication?" "I'm not sure what I'm suggesting," Dad admitted. "But something happened in that moment of contact. Something significant." Travis had been unusually quiet, processing everything we'd shared. Now he spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "What if the drawing wasn't just about the moon and stars? What if it was trying to tell us where it came from?" A chill ran through me at the implications. "You think it's not from Earth?" "I'm not saying it's an alien," Travis clarified quickly. "But maybe it's not entirely natural. Maybe there's something about the full moon that enables it to exist here, in our world." "That's straying into fantasy," Mom objected, though with less conviction than before. "Is it?" Dad challenged gently. "After what we've witnessed these past few nights, can we really dismiss any possibility out of hand?" Before anyone could respond, a new sound penetrated the cabin, that distinctive clicking noise, but louder now, coming from directly above us. "It's on the roof," Travis whispered unnecessarily. We froze. listening as the clicking continued, rhythmic, patterned, unmistakably deliberate. It moved across the roof slowly, as if pacing from one end to the other. "It's trying to communicate again," I said, rising from my seat. "We need to respond." "How?" Mom asked, her voice strained. "We don't understand its language." I moved toward the door. "Maybe not with words, but with presence. With acknowledgement." "Ivy, no," Mom protested, also standing. "You are not going outside." I looked to Dad, appealing silently for support. He studied my face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "We'll go together," he decided. "All of us. Safety in numbers." Mom looked like she wanted to object further, but instead took a deep breath and nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But at the first sign of danger, we come back inside immediately." We gathered on the porch, standing close together as we gazed upward. The clicking had stopped at our emergence, replaced by silence so complete it seemed to press against our ears. Then, with a sound like leather stretching, the creature appeared at the edge of the roof. It regarded us from its elevated position, those reflective eyes moving from face to face before settling on mine. "It recognizes you," Travis whispered. "You're its primary contact." The observation felt right in a way I couldn't explain. I stepped forward slightly, separating myself from the group without leaving the safety of the porch. The creature mirrored my movement, descending from the roof to stand at the edge of the porch steps. At this distance, perhaps 10 feet, its size was even more impressive. Standing upright, it would easily reach 7 feet, though its current posture was slightly hunched, wings folded tightly against its back. For several breaths, we simply observed each other. Then slowly it extended one limb toward me, palm upward, in what appeared to be an invitation. "Don't," Mom breathed, fear evident in her voice. But something beyond fear guided me now, a certainty that transcended caution or logic. I took one step forward, then another, closing the distance between us. "Ivy," Dad cautioned, but didn't move to stop me. When I stood at the edge of the porch, just feet from the creature, it lowered itself to a crouching position, reducing its height to match mine more closely. The gesture seemed deliberately non-threatening, almost deferential. I extended my hand, palm upward like its own. For one breathless moment, nothing happened. Then with exquisite slowness, it reached forward and placed its clawed appendage above my open hand, not touching, but hovering just above, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from its skin. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. Not thoughts in words, but impressions, images, sensations that cascaded through my consciousness. Stars wheeling overhead, wings catching moonlight, ancient forests different yet familiar, a sense of cyclical return, of guardianship, of watching and waiting through countless lunar cycles. And beneath it all, a question, an uncertainty. "Are you ready now?" I gasped, staggering slightly as the connection broke. Dad was at my side instantly, supporting me as the creature withdrew its limb and stepped back. "What happened?" he asked urgently. "Are you all right?" I nodded, struggling to process the flood of information, the alien perspective that had briefly merged with my own. "It's a guardian," I whispered, the words coming before I fully understood their meaning. "It comes with the full moon, has for centuries, watching, protecting." "Protecting what?" Travis asked. I shook my head, the impressions already fading like the details of a vivid dream upon waking. "The balance, I think, between worlds, between what is and what could be." The creature made a final series of clicks that somehow conveyed approval, satisfaction. Then, with a farewell gesture that reminded me strangely of a salute, it spread its enormous wings and launched itself skyward, climbing rapidly until it was lost against the backdrop of stars. We stood in silence, watching the empty space where it had vanished. "Will it come back?" Mom finally asked, her voice small in the vastness of the night. "Yes," I said with certainty. "Not this trip, maybe not even this year, but it will return. It always does." Dad squeezed my shoulder gently. "And when it does, I think it will find you again. For whatever reason, it chose you as its point of contact." I nodded, feeling both the weight and the wonder of that selection. "I'll be ready next time." As we returned inside, the forest around us seemed different, not just darker or more mysterious, but more alive with possibilities I had never before considered. The world had expanded beyond the boundaries of what we thought we knew, and there would be no returning to our previous limitations. Whatever the creature was, undiscovered terrestrial species, interdimensional visitor, or something our language had no classification for, it had transformed us through the simple act of connection. We had been acknowledged by something outside our understanding, and in that acknowledgement, we had glimpsed a larger reality. I still visit that cabin sometimes, though the family vacations became less frequent as we all grew older. Travis went off to college to study biology like Dad, inspired by our encounter. Mom became more accepting of the inexplicable, less insistent on rational explanations for everything. And me, I became a watcher and observer. I developed my artistic talents, documenting the natural world while remaining alert to glimpses of the extraordinary that might exist at its edges. Every full moon, I find myself looking skyward, scanning for a silhouette against the stars. I know it will return someday, and when it does, I'll have questions of my own. But until then, I carry the memory of those nights in New Mexico. The nights when a 16-year-old girl with typical teenage problems encountered something ancient and impossible, and found herself forever changed by the meeting of worlds. The creature had asked, "Are you ready now?" Next time, my answer will be yes. When I was 16, back in 2019, my family decided to spend spring break in a remote cabin nestled deep within the forests of Northern California. My parents had been planning this getaway for months, promising it would be the perfect opportunity to disconnect from our devices and reconnect with each other. The prospect of spending 5 days without decent Wi-Fi seemed torturous at the time, but looking back, I would have gladly traded internet access for the horror that awaited us. The journey to the cabin was long and winding. As we drove deeper into the forest, the road narrowed, and the trees grew denser, creating a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. My father, Thomas, navigated the rental car carefully over the uneven terrain, while my mother, Bridget, tried to keep the mood light by playing our favorite road trip games. In the back seat beside me, my grandmother Elaine sat quietly, her arthritic hands folded neatly in her lap. "We're almost there," my father announced as we rounded a bend in the road. "Just another 10 minutes or so." I peered out the window, watching as the shadows of the trees danced across the ground. There was something unsettling about the forest, a heaviness in the air that seemed to press down on the car. I chalked it up to my imagination, but the feeling persisted as we continued our journey. Finally, the cabin came into view. It was larger than I had expected, with weathered wooden siding and a steep shingled roof. A small porch wrapped around the front, and several windows dotted the exterior, their glass reflecting the afternoon sunlight. "Well, here we are," my father said, pulling the car to a stop in front of the cabin. "Home, sweet home for the next few days." I felt the crisp air on my face as I opened the car door. The scent of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils, and a shiver ran through me despite the mild temperature. I stood for a moment, taking in our surroundings. The cabin was isolated, with no other structures visible through the dense trees. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. As my father helped grandmother from the car and into her wheelchair, I grabbed my backpack from the trunk and headed toward the cabin. The wooden steps of the porch creaked beneath my weight, a sound that would become all too familiar in the days to come. "Michael, sweetie," my mother called after me, "why don't you go up to your room and unpack? We'll get dinner started soon." When I opened the cabin door, I was surprised at the sudden creak it made, the sound echoing through the quiet space. Just inside was a large, open area with a sofa parked in front of a flat-screen TV, a luxury I hadn't expected in such a remote location. There was a kitchen attached to the living room, separated only by a counter lined with bar stools. I walked up the stairs and past a bathroom, noting the dated fixtures and peeling wallpaper. Down the hallway, I entered the room I was supposed to be staying in, and I screamed, because there, right in the middle of the floor, was a dead rat. The rat lay on its side, its body contorted in an unnatural position. What made the sight truly horrifying wasn't just the rat itself, but the condition it was in. It looked like something had been gnawing on it. Its insides had been smeared across the wooden floor, creating a dark, viscous puddle that had begun to dry at the edges. I bolted down the stairs, nearly colliding with my father as he wheeled my grandmother's wheelchair into the cabin. "Dad?" I practically screamed. "There's a dead rat in my room." My father frowned, more annoyed than concerned. "Michael, you're 16 now. If you're old enough to drive, you're old enough to clean up a dead animal." "But Dad, it's not just dead," I protested. "It looks like something was eating it." My mother appeared from behind the car, carrying a box of groceries. "It was probably just another rat," she said dismissively. "Or maybe a snake got to it before it died. It happens in places like this." I wanted to argue further, to make them understand that this wasn't normal, but I could see from their expressions that they weren't taking me seriously. With resignation, I gathered cleaning supplies from under the kitchen sink and trudged back upstairs. I ended up using an entire paper towel roll and a can of Lysol to clean up the rat's remains. The stench was awful, a mixture of decay and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. As I scrubbed at the stain on the floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Once the mess was cleaned, I unpacked my clothes and arranged my belongings, trying to make the space feel less alien. The room was small but comfortable, with a twin bed pushed against one wall and a dresser opposite it. A window overlooked the forest, and as the light began to fade, the trees outside transformed into looming silhouettes against the darkening sky. It was around 6 p.m. when my mother made some mac and cheese with cut-up hot dogs, my favorite comfort food since childhood. I was walking to the couch where my grandmother was seated with my bowl when I noticed something odd about the floor. There was a trapdoor in the middle of the living room. I paused, wondering how I had missed it earlier. It was a square panel set into the floorboards with a small metal ring serving as a handle. "Mom," I called out, "what's this door doing here?" My mother glanced over from the kitchen. Probably access to the crawl space. The rental listing mentioned it. It's used to keep floods from coming into the cabin. This area gets pretty wet during the rainy season." I sat down on the couch and turned on the TV, satisfied with that answer for the moment. The program was some nature documentary, but the reception was poor, the image frequently dissolving into static. Eventually, I gave up and focused on my dinner instead, which was delicious despite our rustic surroundings. As we ate, my father talked enthusiastically about all the outdoor activities he had planned for us. Fishing, hiking, kayaking on the nearby lake. My grandmother smiled and nodded, though I could tell she was tired from the journey. My mother seemed distracted, her eyes occasionally drifting to the windows, as though searching for something in the gathering darkness. After dinner, we played a few rounds of cards before deciding to turn in early. The drive had been long, and we were all feeling the effects of the journey. I helped my father get grandmother settled in the downstairs bedroom, which had been specifically chosen for its accessibility. "Sleep tight, Michael," my mother said as I headed upstairs. "Tomorrow's going to be a full day." I got into my bed and fell asleep surprisingly fast, the warm covers making it that much easier to forget about the dead rat and the strange trap-door. My dreams, however, were restless, filled with shadowy figures and narrow, winding passages that led deeper and deeper into an endless darkness. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of shuffling. It was faint but distinct, a scraping noise that seemed to come from below. At first, I thought it might be my parents or grandmother moving around downstairs. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the sound was too rhythmic, too persistent to be human movement. I stepped out of my room, leaving the door slightly ajar. As I peered into the dusty hall, I noticed nothing but the moonlit shadows dancing on the wall. The shuffling sound continued as I crept down the stairs leading to the living room, careful to avoid the spots that had creaked under my weight earlier. The living room was bathed in silvery moonlight that streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. My eyes were immediately drawn to the trapdoor, which seemed more prominent now in the dim light. I placed my ear to the floor, and just as I suspected, the sounds were coming from beneath the house. Dread washed over me as the fear of something scurrying around under there hit me. Rats, perhaps, maybe a whole colony of them, which would explain the mangled corpse I'd found in my room. Being the idiot I was, I thought I could handle whatever was down there. So I grabbed my flashlight from my backpack, which I'd left by the couch, and decided to investigate. The trapdoor was heavier than I expected, but I managed to lift it open, revealing a dark void below. The air that rose from the opening was cold and damp, carrying with it a musty odor that made me recoil. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, revealing a dirt floor about 4 feet below the opening. A rudimentary ladder made of wooden slats attached to the wall provided access to the crawl space. Maybe a dozen rats scattered as I climbed down into the cold, damp space, their eyes reflecting briefly in my flashlight beam before they disappeared into the darkness. The crawl space was huge, reminding me disturbingly of a maze. Support beams created a labyrinth of shadowy corridors that stretched in multiple directions under the cabin. I can't tell if I was being really brave or really stupid, but I crawled deeper into the space, the dirt cool against my palms. The shuffling sound had stopped, but now I could hear something else, a faint dripping somewhere in the distance. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating cobwebs and exposed insulation. The ceiling of the crawlspace, the underside of the cabin's floor, was crisscrossed with pipes and electrical wiring. It was a tight fit, forcing me to crouch low as I moved forward. I'm not sure how long I crawled or how far I went, but eventually I noticed a dimly lit corner about 10 feet ahead of me. It wasn't the bright white of my flashlight, but a softer, more diffuse glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Suddenly, there was movement, and I shone my flashlight directly at the source. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. There was a figure, a silhouette with long arms and pale skin hunched down in the corner. Its eyes reflected white off my flashlight, large and unblinking. I was completely stunned as the thing started to screech, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that reverberated through the confined space. Looking back, I realized the flashlight probably hurt its eyes and startled it. But in that moment, all I could think about was escape. You better believe I turned myself right around and began to speed crawl as fast as I could, my elbows and knees scraping painfully against the dirt floor. I glanced back only once to see that thing following me, and quickly. It moved in a bizarre, spider-like manner, wrapping long fingers around the support beams to help propel itself forward. Its body was emaciated, skin stretched tight over protruding bones, and its mouth, oh God, its mouth, was filled with rows of needle-like teeth. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities as I scrambled through the darkness. I could only assume that this thing had been feeding off the rats, and that I had found its leftovers in my room. If it could do something like that to a rat, I was terrified at the thought of what it could do to me. The crawl space seemed much larger now, and I was beginning to think I was lost. With each foot I moved, that thing was gaining on me, its labored breathing growing louder behind me. The soft scraping of its body against the ground sent waves of terror through my body. I thought all hope was lost, until I finally saw the trap door coming up ahead, the faint moonlight from the living room creating a silver rectangle in the darkness. As soon as I reached it, I tackled it open and scrambled out, my hands gripping the edges of the opening as I pulled myself up. I felt something beginning to grab at my ankle, its touch ice cold against my skin. I swear I felt hot breath against the back of my leg, moist and rancid. I kicked wildly, connecting with something solid, and heard a hiss of pain. With one final effort, I pulled myself completely out of the crawl space and slammed the trapdoor closed. Something began to claw and push at it from the other side, the wooden panel shuddering under the assault. I threw my body on top of the door, pressing down with all my weight as my heart threatened to burst from my chest. The thing continued to throw itself against the underside of the door, each impact sending shockwaves through my body. After what seemed like an eternity, the thrashing and struggling stopped. I remained frozen in place, afraid that moving even an inch would somehow allow the creature to escape. Only when my muscles began to cramp did I slowly, cautiously roll off the trapdoor. For several minutes I lay on the floor, gasping for breath, my clothes soaked with sweat. When I finally managed to stand, my legs were so weak they could barely support me. I staggered to the couch and collapsed, my mind replaying the horrifying encounter over and over. I knew I needed to tell my parents. Whatever was down there wasn't natural, and we needed to leave immediately. I bolted upstairs to my parents' room and began to bang on the door, screaming, "Dad! Mom!" My father groggily opened the door, his hair disheveled and his eyes heavy with sleep. "Michael, what in the world are you doing?" "Dad, we have to go," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "There's something in the house, under the house. I saw it. It tried to grab me." My father frowned, rubbing his eyes. "You had a nightmare, son. Go back to bed." "No, Dad, you don't understand. It wasn't a nightmare. There's something living in the crawl space. It killed that rat I found earlier. It's real, I swear." My mother appeared behind my father, wrapping her robe tightly around herself. "Michael, it's the middle of the night. You probably just saw a raccoon or a possum that found its way under the cabin." I tried to explain that what I had seen was no raccoon, that it had walked on two legs, had hands with long fingers, that its eyes had reflected the light in a way no animals would. But the more I described it, the more skeptical my parents became. "That's enough, Michael," my father said firmly. "Go back to bed. We'll check the crawl space in the morning if it'll make you feel better." I wanted to scream with frustration. Why wouldn't they believe me? Couldn't they see the dirt on my clothes, the scratches on my arms? But arguing further seemed pointless. With a heavy heart, I returned to my bedroom, where I did not sleep a wink. I was too scared, too alert, listening for any sound that might indicate the creature had found another way into the cabin. The following morning was bright and clear, with sunlight streaming through the windows and birds chirping cheerfully outside. It was as if the events of the previous night had been nothing but a bad dream, almost. My body told a different story. My elbows and knees were raw from crawling through the dirt, and there was a bruise forming on my ankle where the creature had grabbed me. I examined the mark in the bathroom mirror. 5 distinct, finger-shaped discolorations that couldn't be explained away as a figment of my imagination. When I went downstairs for breakfast, my parents were already up. My mother was frying bacon and eggs, while my father sat at the table reading a brochure about local hiking trails. My grandmother was seated by the window, bathed in sunlight as she knitted something small and blue. "Good morning, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice overly cheerful. "How did you sleep?" I stared at her in disbelief. "I didn't, because of the thing in the crawl space." My father sighed, putting down his brochure. "Michael, I checked the trap door this morning while you were getting dressed. There's nothing unusual down there except some pipes and insulation. And a few rat droppings, which explains what happened to the one you found yesterday. You went down there?" I asked, my voice rising with alarm. "Just a quick look," he replied. "I didn't crawl all the way through, but I didn't see anything concerning." "It's just a normal crawl space." I wanted to argue, to insist that he hadn't gone far enough, that the creature was hiding deeper within the labyrinth beneath the house. But the set of his jaw told me it would be useless. Instead, I sat down and mechanically ate the breakfast my mother placed in front of me, tasting nothing. After breakfast, my father announced that we would be going fishing on the nearby lake. I wanted to refuse, to stay behind where I could keep an eye on the trapdoor, but the thought of being alone in the cabin was even more terrifying. So I found myself following my father down to the lake, carrying fishing rods and a tackle box, while he pushed grandmother in her wheelchair along a rough path through the woods. He got the fishing rods set up, and we boarded a small rowboat that had been tied to a weathered dock. My grandmother remained on shore, content to watch us from the shade of a large oak tree. As we rowed out onto the lake, I kept glancing back at the cabin, which was just visible through the trees. "You need to relax, son," my father said, misinterpreting my anxiety. "That's what this trip is all about, getting away from stress." I didn't catch any fish that day, but my father caught 3 decent-sized trout, which he cleaned on the dock with practiced movements. Despite my fear, I found myself able to enjoy these moments with him, moments of normalcy that temporarily pushed back the dread that had taken root in my chest. As the day progressed, I began to wonder if perhaps my father was right. Maybe what I had seen was just an animal, distorted by fear and the beam of my flashlight. Maybe the isolation of the cabin was playing tricks on my mind. But then I remembered those eyes, that unnaturally pale skin, those long, grasping fingers, and I knew it was no trick of the light, no figment of my imagination. Eventually, dawn turned to dusk, and we returned to the cabin. My mother had prepared a simple dinner, and afterward we roasted marshmallows in the small fire pit on the porch, an activity both my grandmother and mother loved. They used to go camping when my mother was younger, and they shared stories of those trips as we toasted our marshmallows to golden perfection. The s'mores I made were delicious, perfectly gooey, but I couldn't fully enjoy them. My eyes kept drifting to the windows of the cabin, searching for any movement, any sign that something was watching us from within. As night fell, the forest around us seemed to close in, the darkness between the trees absolute. The fire cast our shadows large against the cabin wall, and I couldn't shake the feeling that among them was a shape that didn't belong to any of us. It was finally bedtime again, but I was terrified at the thought of that creature trying to hurt my family. I barricaded my door with the dresser and wedged the window shut with a book, creating what I hoped would be an impenetrable fortress. I didn't think I could sleep that night, but somehow, someway, exhaustion overcame fear, and I was able to doze off. I awoke at some point deep in the night, hearing the unmistakable sound of the trapdoor creaking open. My heart sank into my chest as a sense of dread like no other hit me. I lay paralyzed in my bed, straining to hear any further sounds from downstairs. Right then, I heard the sound of cupboards in the kitchen slamming open and shut, followed by the clatter of something metallic hitting the floor. I wondered if it was that thing looking for food, or for me. I started to hyperventilate as I heard the steps creaking one by one, a slow, deliberate ascent that told me whatever was coming up wasn't trying to be stealthy anymore. Hundreds of questions raced through my mind. Was my barricade strong enough? Could the creature open doors? Then again, it had opened the trap door with ease. Was my family safe, or had it already? I couldn't bear to complete that thought. I heard scratching sounds coming from the hallway, then a light thud against my door. The doorknob jiggled violently, and I held my breath. The dresser blocking the door shifted slightly with each shove, moving inch by inch across the floor. Suddenly, everything stopped as I heard another door opening down the hall, my parents' room. My father's voice, groggy but alarmed. "Hello! Who's there?" Then there was this awful ear-splitting screech that seemed to pierce right through my skull. It was followed by the sound of shattering glass and my father shouting something unintelligible. I bolted to my door, shoving the dresser aside with strength I didn't know I possessed. When I flung the door open, I saw my father standing just outside his doorway with his fishing knife clutched in his hand. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. "Dad," I whispered, afraid to speak any louder. He turned to me slowly, the knife lowering to his side. "I saw it," he said, his voice barely audible. "You were right. There was something." I looked to my right and saw what had captured his attention, a trail of blood leading from my parents' bedroom to a broken window at the end of the hall. The glass had been completely shattered, and the curtains billowed inward with the night breeze. "It was going through our things," my mother said from the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Thomas heard it first. When he turned on the light, it was standing right there at the foot of our bed, holding my jewelry box. "What was it?" I asked, although I already knew. "I don't know," my father admitted, a tremor in his voice that I'd never heard before. "But it wasn't human. And when I tried to approach it, it screamed and went right through the window. I think I cut it with the knife, but I'm not sure." We stood there in the hallway, the three of us frozen in a tableau of fear and disbelief. Then a voice called up from downstairs, my grandmother, awakened by the commotion. "Thomas! Bridget, is everything all right up there?" That same night, we packed our things and left the cabin without a word. My father carried my grandmother to the car, while my mother and I threw our belongings hastily into suitcases. We didn't bother with the things we'd left in the bathroom or scattered around the living room. None of us wanted to spend another minute in that place. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. In the moonlight, it looked peaceful, ordinary, a deception that masked the horror within. And just before the trees obscured my view, I thought I saw a pale face watching us from the broken upstairs window, its eyes reflecting the light of our taillights. The drive back to civilization was tense and quiet. No one spoke for the first hour, each of us lost in our own thoughts, processing what we had experienced. It wasn't until we reached the main highway, with its comforting streetlights and occasional passing cars, that my father finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you, Michael," he said, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "I should have listened." "What are we going to do?" my mother asked from the passenger seat. "Should we report this to someone?" My father hesitated. "And tell them what? That we were attacked by some creature living under a rental cabin? They'd think we were insane. But what if other people rent that place?" I asked. "What if whatever that thing is hurts someone else?" It was a question none of us had a good answer for. In the end, my father compromised by calling the rental agency once we were back home, claiming we had found evidence of a severe rodent infestation and structural damage to one of the upstairs windows. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough to ensure that the cabin would be inspected before being rented out again. The weeks that followed our hasty departure were difficult. I had nightmares almost every night, reliving the terror of the crawl space and the creature's pursuit. In these dreams, I never made it out of the trapdoor in time, and would wake up gasping for breath, feeling phantom fingers grasping at my ankles. My parents struggled too, though they tried to hide it. I would sometimes find my father sitting alone in the dark, staring at nothing, his mind clearly back in that cabin. My mother became obsessive about checking the locks on our doors and windows before bed, and she insisted on installing motion sensor lights around the perimeter of our house. Grandmother was perhaps the least affected, or at least she seemed to be. When I asked her about it one afternoon, as she knitted in her favorite chair, she simply said, "There are things in this world that we aren't meant to understand, Michael. Some corners where darkness has found a home. But what was it?" I pressed. "What could it have been?" She looked at me with eyes that suddenly seemed much older and wiser than I had ever noticed before. "People have always told stories about creatures that live in the shadows, things that drift through walls and feed on fear as much as flesh. In my village in the old country, they spoke of the hollow ones who made their homes beneath houses and haunted the dreams of children." I didn't know if my grandmother truly believed these tales or if she was just trying to make sense of what had happened in her own way. But there was something in her calm acceptance that I found strangely comforting. About a month after our return, my father received a call from the rental agency. They had sent someone to inspect the cabin based on our complaint, and they had found evidence of an intruder, clothes and personal items that didn't belong to any previous renters scattered in the crawl space, along with animal remains and other debris. The police were investigating it as a case of squatting, or possibly a drifter using the cabin during vacant periods. My father relayed this information to us at dinner that night, and I could see that he wanted to believe this explanation. A human intruder, no matter how disturbed, was something he could understand, something that fit within the boundaries of his rational world. But I knew better. What I had seen in that crawl space wasn't human. The way it moved, the sounds it made, those reflective eyes, no explanation involving a squatter or drifter could account for these things. I considered researching similar encounters, looking for patterns or explanations that might help me make sense of what had happened. But each time I sat down at my computer, I found myself hesitating, afraid of what I might discover. Sometimes ignorance truly is bliss. It's been 6 years since our stay at that cabin, and my family has not been anywhere near the woods since. The experience changed us in ways that are difficult to articulate to others. A shared trauma that created both a bond and a barrier between us and the rest of the world. I'm in college now, studying psychology with a focus on trauma and fear responses. My professors often comment on my unique perspective, unaware of the experiences that shaped it. Sometimes I consider sharing my story as part of a research project or paper, but I always decide against it. Some things are too personal, too raw to dissect academically. My parents divorced 3 years after the incident. My father became increasingly withdrawn and started drinking heavily. My mother couldn't understand what was happening to him, and eventually the strain became too much. I don't blame either of them. Fear changes people, erodes relationships in ways that are often invisible until it's too late. Grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep last winter. In her final years, she spoke more openly about the old stories from her childhood, tales of creatures that lived between worlds, entities that fed on negative emotions and could take on almost human forms. I listened to these stories with a mixture of dread and fascination, wondering how much truth they contained. I still have nightmares sometimes, though they're less frequent now. In the worst of them, I'm back in that crawl space. But instead of fleeing from the creature, I'm becoming it, my limbs elongating, my skin growing pale, my teeth sharpening to points as I learn to navigate the darkness beneath the floorboards. I've tried to research the history of that cabin and the land it was built on, but my efforts have yielded little concrete information. The rental agency went out of business a few years ago, and the property records are vague about previous owners. One thing I did discover, though, was a local newspaper article from 1978 about the disappearance of a family of 4 who had been vacationing in the area. Their car was found abandoned near a hiking trail, but no trace of the family was ever discovered. The article mentioned they had been staying at a cabin that, from the description, could very well have been the same one we rented. Was there a connection? I'll probably never know for certain, and perhaps that's for the best. Some questions are better left unanswered, some doors better left unopened. Keep safe as best you can, everyone. If you hear strange noises at a new place, don't hesitate to run or to call the police. Trust your instincts. You never know what lies near you, or rather beneath you. Because the thing that haunts me most isn't the memory of those reflective eyes or grasping fingers. It's the thought that there might be more creatures like it out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for someone else to lift the wrong trapdoor or peer into the wrong dark corner. And if you ever find yourself in Northern California, near a certain remote lake surrounded by towering pines, keep driving. Whatever you do, don't stop. Don't stay. Some places harbor darkness that extends far beyond the absence of light. I'm a 32-year-old woman living in a beach town in Southern California. where the ocean meets mountains and river bottoms carve through the landscape. My apartment sits in an unfortunate location, just behind the Seaside Motor Lodge, a dilapidated motel with a disturbing history. Back in the 1980s, a serial killer allegedly used one of the rooms as a temporary workshop, keeping dismembered remains in a bathtub before disposal. The police never confirmed these rumors publicly, but locals speak of it with grim certainty. Between our apartment complex and the motel lies an abandoned lot surrounded by rusted chain-link fencing. My roommate Tessa and I named it Murder Lot in a failed attempt at humor that somehow stuck. The vegetation has gone wild. Tangled bushes and scraggly trees create dense shadows, even during daylight. You can't help but imagine what might be hiding there. Homeless individuals, wild animals, or something worse. There's a narrow walkway that winds behind our building, passing right beneath my bathroom window. The window sits about 6.5 feet from the ground, too high for anyone to see in, but not impossible to reach. I've always felt unsettled when walking past Murder Lot, particularly after sunset. Something about the darkness there feels different, like it's watching me. April 19th, 2022 was when everything changed. Tessa had offered me a cannabis gummy to help with muscle pain after I'd spent the weekend helping my parents move furniture. I rarely partake, but the soreness convinced me to accept. That night, I dreamed of being hunted. In my dream, I was hiking a familiar trail near our apartment. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the path. I kept glimpsing movement in my peripheral vision, something following me, matching my pace. Each time I turned to look, nothing was there. But I knew with absolute certainty I wasn't alone. The dream trail led me back toward my apartment, but as I neared home, the figure stepped into view. It walked like a person, but moved wrong, joints bending in impossible directions, its silhouette constantly shifting. I tried to scream, but couldn't make a sound. I woke gasping, heart hammering against my ribs. I dismissed it as a bad reaction to the cannabis. Just my brain processing unfamiliar chemicals. Nothing more. For 2 weeks, everything was normal. Then Tessa left for a business trip to San Diego, leaving me alone with her cat, Ash. The first night passed uneventfully. The second night, everything changed. I was sleeping deeply when a piercing electronic beep jolted me awake. Ash, who had been curled against my side, leapt up with his fur standing on end. The smoke detector was shrieking in 3-beat pulses. Beep, 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 then silence, then another set. I sat up, disoriented and sweating. The room felt stifling. Fire, I thought, stumbling out of bed. I rushed toward the bedroom door, expecting to smell smoke or see an orange glow from the living room. Instead, as I stepped into the hallway, the beeping stopped abruptly. The apartment was dark and still. No smoke, no fire, nothing to explain the alarm. My heart continued pounding as I moved toward the living room windows, checking outside for any signs of danger. The night was quiet. The street lamps cast pools of yellow light on empty pavement. Nothing seemed amiss until my eyes settled on a figure sitting perfectly still in the shadows near Murder Lot's fence. It was a cat, entirely white, so bright it seemed to glow in the darkness. It sat facing the overgrown lot, completely motionless. Something about its stillness unnerved me. Cats don't sit that perfectly still for that long. I stood watching it, barely breathing. The white cat never moved, never blinked, just stared intently into the darkness of Murder Lot, as if witnessing something invisible to me. A soft pressure against my ankle broke my concentration. Ash rubbing against my leg, purring. I glanced down for just a second to acknowledge him. When I looked back up, the white cat had vanished. I pressed my face against the glass, scanning the area where it had been. Nothing, no movement, no white shape disappearing into the bushes. It was as if the cat had never existed. I checked the apartment thoroughly. No signs of smoke or fire, no malfunctioning detectors. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was deeply wrong. When I finally returned to bed, I found myself shivering despite the warm night air. The sheets felt cold against my skin, as if all the heat had been drained from my body. I lay awake until dawn, listening to every creak and settling noise in the building. unable to dislodge the image of that white cat from my mind, its unblinking stare, its unnatural stillness, its impossible disappearance. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined the white cat. Sleep deprivation combined with being startled awake could explain the hallucination. The smoke detector must have malfunctioned, a low battery perhaps. I made a mental note to check it later and tried to move on with my day. But as I left for work, something caught my eye. The chain-link fence surrounding Murder Lot had changed. A section near where I'd seen the white cat was bent inward, creating a gap between the fence and the ground, large enough for an animal to crawl through. Or perhaps a very slender person. I approached cautiously, examining the damaged section. The metal wasn't freshly bent. Rust had formed along the creases, suggesting it had been this way for some time. How had I never noticed it before? I'd walked past this fence hundreds of times. As I stood there, the hair on the back of my neck suddenly stood up. I had the overwhelming sensation of being watched from within the overgrown lot. My eyes scanned the dense vegetation, searching for movement, but saw nothing beyond tangled branches and shadows. Still, the feeling persisted, an intense awareness of hidden eyes tracking my movements. I backed away from the fence and hurried to my car, looking over my shoulder repeatedly until I was safely inside with the doors locked. Throughout my workday at the local library, I found myself distracted, replaying the previous night's events. The smoke alarm, the white cat, the damaged fence. Individually, each could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that made me deeply uneasy. That evening, I found myself researching local wildlife on my laptop. Could the white cat have been a feral cat? Perhaps an albino fox mistaken for a cat in the poor lighting. None of the explanations felt right. My research led me down increasingly strange paths. I found myself reading about folklore, stories of animals that weren't what they seemed, creatures that mimicked human behaviors to lure unsuspecting victims. I closed my browser, embarrassed by the direction my thoughts had taken. This wasn't some remote forest or ancient village. This was Southern California in 2022. When Tessa returned the following day, I considered telling her about the strange occurrences, but decided against it. The story sounded absurd even in my own head. Instead, I suggested we report the damaged fence to our building manager. That fence has been bent for months, Tessa said, surprising me. I thought you knew. I guess I never really paid attention, I lied, not wanting to admit I'd somehow missed such an obvious detail. Well, the property management doesn't care. I've reported it twice, she continued, scratching ash behind his ears. Apparently it's technically on motel property, so our landlord says it's not his problem. That night I dreamed of the white cat again. In the dream, it sat at the foot of my bed watching me with unblinking eyes. When I tried to move, I found myself paralyzed. The cat began to grow larger, its form stretching and distorting until it no longer resembled a cat at all. I woke up drenched in sweat, convinced for a terrifying moment that something was crouched at the end of my bed. The room was empty, of course, but sleep eluded me for the remainder of the night. The following weeks passed uneventfully. No more phantom alarms, no white cat sightings. I began to relax, convincing myself I'd experienced nothing more than an unusual combination of coincidences and an overactive imagination. Then came the night in May when everything escalated. May 17, 2022, started as a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. I worked my regular shift at the library, came home, made dinner with Tessa, and settled in for a quiet evening. Around 8:30 p.m., I decided to take a shower. I'm hitting the shower, I called to Tessa, who was engrossed in a reality TV show in the living room. Need the bathroom before I monopolize it? I'm good, she replied without looking away from the screen. I left the bathroom door unlocked, a habit we'd developed since Ash's litter box was kept in there. The cat hated closed doors and would howl pitifully if denied access to any room in the apartment. The shower felt wonderful after a long day. I lost myself in the steam and warmth, shampooing my hair with my eyes closed. That's when I heard it. 3 distinct knocks on what I assumed was the bathroom door. I pulled back the shower curtain slightly. "Yeah?" I called out, expecting Tessa to respond. "It's me," came a sing-song voice that sounded like a distorted version of Tessa's. The voice wasn't quite right. It had the same cadence as Tessa's, but sounded off somehow, like someone doing a poor impression of her. Still, I didn't think much of it. We often used silly voices when talking to each other around the apartment. "Come in," I said, assuming Ash needed the litter box. I heard the door open. Keeping the shower curtain pulled to cover myself, I peeked out, expecting to see Tessa, or at least Ash, entering. Instead, I saw the empty bathroom, the door now standing open to the dark hallway beyond. No one was there. My body went rigid. I stood frozen, water still running down my back, staring at the empty doorway. After a few seconds that felt like hours, I managed to reach out with a trembling hand and pull the shower curtain closed again. I finished my shower in record time, my mind racing through explanations. Perhaps Tessa had knocked, then decided she didn't need the bathroom after all. Maybe I'd imagined the voice entirely. The running water could have distorted some other sound from elsewhere in the apartment. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The voice had been too strange, too unlike Tessa despite attempting to mimic her. And why would she open the door, then leave without saying anything? I turned off the water and reached for my towel, drying off quickly while still in the shower stall. I dressed in record time, not wanting to be vulnerable for a second longer than necessary. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out into the hallway. Tessa was still in the living room, sitting in exactly the same position as when I'd left for my shower. She looked up as I entered. "That was quick," she commented. My mouth felt dry. "Did you just knock on the bathroom door?" She frowned, shaking her head. "No, I've been watching this the whole time." I believed her. The show she'd been watching was still playing. She couldn't have made it to the bathroom and back without missing part of it. Besides, her confusion seemed genuine. "I heard knocking," I said slowly, "and a voice that sounded like someone trying to sound like you." A flicker of concern crossed her face. "Maybe it was from next door." "The walls are pretty thin," I nodded, wanting to believe this explanation. But our neighbors on the bathroom side were an elderly couple who rarely made noise, and the voice hadn't sounded muffled, as it would have if it had come through the wall. It had sounded like it was right outside the bathroom door. Then a horrifying thought struck me, one I'd been subconsciously avoiding. The bathroom had another entrance point, the window. The window that faced the narrow walkway behind our building. The walkway that connected to Murder Lot. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined a figure standing outside our bathroom window, knocking on the glass, calling out in that twisted mimicry of Tessa's voice. I kept thinking about the height of the window, 6.5 feet off the ground, too high for a normal person to reach without something to stand on. But what if they weren't normal? The next morning, I suggested to Tessa that we install a lock on the bathroom window. She agreed without asking too many questions, assuming it was a general safety precaution. I was grateful for her unquestioning support, even as I kept the full extent of my fears to myself. For the next few weeks, I was hyper-vigilant. I took shorter showers with the bathroom door locked. I avoided being near windows after dark. I started researching security systems we could install despite our rental agreement limitations. Gradually, as nothing else unusual occurred, I began to lower my guard again. Perhaps it had been a bizarre one-time event, a prank by neighborhood teenagers, or a vivid auditory hallucination brought on by stress. Either explanation seemed preferable to the alternatives my imagination conjured in the dark hours of the night. Then came the third incident, the one that convinced me something truly sinister was happening in our neighborhood. It was June 4th, 2022, a Saturday night. Tessa had gone to visit her parents for the weekend, taking Ash with her. I was alone in the apartment, trying to enjoy the rare solitude by watching a documentary about deep-sea creatures. Around 11:30 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I had just settled into bed, flipping through a novel to read myself to sleep, when I heard it, A man's voice, clearly distraught, coming from somewhere outside. "Someone please help me." The voice was loud enough to hear through my closed window, but something about it sounded wrong. The words were clear, but the tone was off, flat despite the desperate plea, almost mechanical in its delivery. I set my book down and moved cautiously to the window, peering through a gap in the blinds. The street below was empty, illuminated by the yellow glow of street lamps. No one was visible, yet the voice continued, "Someone please help me. Someone please help me." The repetition was unsettling, the exact same intonation each time, as if the words were being played on a loop. I scanned the street more carefully, looking for any sign of movement or distress. Nothing. But the voice continued, unchanging in its cadence and volume. There was something deeply wrong about it, not just the mechanical repetition, but the voice itself. It sounded human, but with subtle distortions that made my skin crawl. As I watched, lights came on in neighboring apartments. Front doors opened as other residents stepped outside, looking around in confusion. An older man from the building across the street called out, "Hello, where are you?" No response came except the continued pleas for help. Still in that same unnatural tone, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, explaining that someone appeared to be in distress in our neighborhood, though I couldn't locate them. "We've received several calls about this," the operator informed me. "Officers are on their way to investigate." Somewhat relieved that help was coming, I continued to watch from my window. The voice seemed to be moving now, growing slightly louder as if approaching our street corner. More neighbors emerged from their homes, some venturing further down the street in search of the source. After about 15 minutes, the voice began to fade, moving away from our immediate area. One by one, my neighbors returned to their homes, conversations drifting up to my window. Probably some drunk guy. Could be a prank. Weird how he kept saying the same thing over and over. I remained at my window, peering into the darkness long after the others had gone inside. Something compelled me to keep watching, some instinct warning me that this wasn't over. Nearly an hour after the voice had first appeared, I noticed movement near the far end of the street, where it intersected with a less populated road leading toward the river bottom. A figure crossed under a distant street lamp, moving in a strange, disjointed manner. From that distance, I couldn't make out details, just a dark silhouette against the yellow lamplight. But the way it moved sent ice through my veins. The gait was uneven, jerky, as if the limbs weren't quite connected properly. One moment it seemed to limp heavily, the next it moved with unnatural quickness. I watched, transfixed with horror, as the figure paused beneath the street lamp, then slowly turned to face in my direction. Though it was too far away to possibly see me watching from my darkened window, I had the distinct impression it was looking directly at me. For several heartbeats, it remained motionless. Then with that same awkward wrong movement, it continued across the pool of light and disappeared into the darkness beyond. Moments later, 2 police cruisers drove slowly down our street, spotlights scanning the area. They paused at the intersection where I'd seen the figure, then continued onward. I considered calling them back, telling them about what I'd seen, but what would I say? That I'd spotted someone walking strangely at a distance? That didn't constitute an emergency. I double-checked that all doors and windows were locked, then retreated to my bedroom. Sleep was out of the question. I sat up with the lights on until dawn, jumping at every creak and settling noise in the building. When Tessa returned the following evening, I told her about the incident, or at least a sanitized version of it. I mentioned the voice calling for help and the police response, but omitted the details about the figure's unnatural movements and the sensation of being watched. Even to myself, those elements sounded like the product of an overactive imagination, fueled by lack of sleep and the eerie repetition of the disembodied voice. Probably some guy trying to freak people out, Tessa suggested, unloading Ash's carrier. Or someone having a mental health crisis. I nodded, wanting to believe her rational explanation, but in the weeks that followed, I found myself increasingly uneasy in our apartment. The three incidents, the white cat, the bathroom knocking, and now the voice, had formed a pattern I couldn't ignore, despite lacking any clear connection between them. I began researching our neighborhood's history, looking for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. The serial killer who had allegedly used the motel was well documented. Thomas Wayne Barstow, arrested in 1986 after the discoveries of multiple victims along the coastline. But nothing in his case suggested anything supernatural or explained the events I'd experienced. I expanded my search, looking into local legends and folklore. Most were the standard fare of small-town ghost stories. Haunted buildings, tragic drownings in the river, mysterious lights on the mountains. Nothing that aligned with what I'd witnessed. Then I found an obscure forum post from 2015, written by someone claiming to have lived in our neighborhood a decade earlier. They described hearing a voice calling for help late at night, followed by sightings of something that wasn't quite human, moving through the streets. The post had received little attention. A few dismissive comments calling the author delusional or attention-seeking. But the similarities to my experience sent chills down my spine. Was it possible that whatever I'd encountered had been active in the area for years? If so, why weren't there more reports? I printed the forum post and tucked it into my desk drawer, unsure what to do with the information, but unwilling to dismiss it entirely. Something was happening in our neighborhood, something beyond normal explanation, and I seemed to be one of the few people aware of it. The mounting evidence of something unnatural in our neighborhood drove me to more extensive research. I took a week off from work, claiming I needed personal time, which wasn't entirely untrue. My sleep had become fragmented, punctuated by nightmares and periods of lying awake, listening for sounds outside my window. I started by methodically documenting everything I could remember about the three incidents. I created a detailed timeline, noting weather conditions, moon phases, and any other potentially relevant factors. Looking for patterns felt like grasping at straws, but I needed some framework to understand what was happening. The local library proved disappointing. Their section on local history focused primarily on the town's founding, its growth during the tourism boom of the 1960s, and profiles of notable residents. The serial killer Barstow merited only a brief mention in a book about California crime, with no details that I hadn't already discovered online. I expanded my search to neighboring towns, driving to their libraries and historical societies. In a small archive in a community 20 miles inland, I found something intriguing, a collection of newspaper clippings from the 1950s about a series of disappearances in our region. The disappearances had occurred over a 3-year period. Between 1952 and 1955, 7 people had vanished without explanation, 3 hikers in the nearby mountains, a night watchman at a warehouse near the river, 2 teenagers last seen walking home from a movie theater, and a middle-aged woman who had gone to check her mail after dark and never returned to her house. What caught my attention wasn't just the disappearances themselves, but the reports from witnesses before each vanishing. Several accounts mentioned hearing cries for help at night, followed by strange sightings, figures moving in unnatural ways, animals behaving oddly, and in one case, a person who wasn't a person seen near the river. The newspaper articles treated these reports as the product of mass hysteria and rural superstition. The disappearances were attributed to mountain accidents, runaways, and possibly a human predator who was never identified. By 1956, the incidents had stopped, and the case faded from public attention. I photocopied every article I could find, adding them to my growing file of research. The similarities to my experiences were undeniable, but they raised more questions than answers. If the same entity had been active in the 1950s, why the decades-long gap before resurfacing? And what exactly was it? My research led me to explore various cultural myths about creatures that could mimic human appearance or voices. The legends were widespread across different cultures. Skinwalkers in Navajo tradition, Bakaneko in Japanese folklore, the not deer phenomenon in Appalachian stories. Each described entities that existed in the uncanny valley between human and animal, capable of mimicry, but never quite getting the details right. I felt ridiculous pursuing these explanations, a well-educated woman in modern California researching folk monsters to explain strange occurrences. But the conventional explanations felt increasingly inadequate. Pranksters wouldn't maintain such an elaborate hoax over months. Mental illness couldn't explain the shared experiences of my neighbors hearing the voice. And none of these explained the white cat's impossible disappearance or the knocking at my bathroom door when Tessa was clearly elsewhere. As my week off drew to a close, I'd compiled an extensive file of research but reached no definitive conclusions. The most consistent pattern I could identify was that all three incidents had occurred when I was alone or separated from others. The white cat appeared when Tessa was away. The bathroom knocking happened when I was isolated in the shower, and the voice called out when I was alone in the apartment. Was I being specifically targeted? If so, why me? I had no connection to the area's history. I'd moved here just 2 years ago for the library position after graduating with my master's degree in library science. There was nothing special about me that would attract supernatural attention, unless a disturbing thought occurred to me. What if it wasn't targeting me specifically, but rather anyone who noticed it? The white cat had appeared after I'd taken the cannabis gummy and had that dream. Perhaps the altered state had made me more perceptive to something that had been there all along, something most people filtered out or rationalized away. By noticing it, had I somehow drawn its attention to me? I returned to work the following Monday. My research inconclusive, but my vigilance heightened. I began taking precautions. I never walked near Murder-Lot alone. I installed a security camera facing my bedroom window, and I kept a journal of anything unusual I noticed, no matter how small. Tessa grew concerned about my behavior, but accepted my explanation that the recent strange events had left me feeling unsafe. She supported my security measures and even began accompanying me more often when I needed to go out after dark. For several weeks, nothing unusual occurred. No white cats, no knocking, no voices calling for help. I began to hope that whatever had been happening had stopped. Perhaps it had moved on to another area, or my increased vigilance had somehow deterred it. Then came the night that shattered this fragile hope and convinced me that the entity wasn't gone. It was merely watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. July 8th, 2022, marked exactly 1 month since the incident with the voice calling for help. The date's significance didn't register with me until later. I was simply grateful for the stretch of normalcy that had followed my research week. That evening, Tessa had plans to meet friends for dinner, leaving me alone in the apartment. I'll probably be back around midnight, she told me as she gathered her purse. Don't wait up. Have fun, I replied, settling on the couch with my laptop. I had plans to catch up on emails and maybe watch a movie, a quiet Friday night at home. After Tessa left, I heated up leftover pasta for dinner and opened a bottle of wine. The apartment felt peaceful rather than threatening for the first time in weeks. Perhaps, I thought, the whole ordeal had been a bizarre series of coincidences after all, amplified by stress and an overactive imagination. Around 9:30 p.m., I decided to take advantage of the quiet evening to have a relaxing bath, something I'd avoided since the bathroom knocking incident. I filled the tub with hot water, added lavender bath salts, and even lit a few candles. The bathroom window remained securely locked, with a new blackout curtain covering it for additional privacy. I had just lowered myself into the soothing water when my phone, sitting on the closed toilet lid, began to ring. The screen showed Tessa's name. I reached for it, water dripping from my arm. "Hey, what's up?" I answered. There was silence on the other end, then a strange sound like breathing but oddly rhythmic and mechanical. "Tessa?" I said, sitting up straighter in the tub. "Can you hear me?" More of that strange breathing, then a voice that sent ice through my veins, despite the hot water surrounding me. "I'm at the window." The voice was Tessa's, but wrong. The same distorted quality I'd heard through the bathroom door that night. A poor imitation, with the cadence slightly off and the tone unnaturally flat. I immediately ended the call, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone in the bathwater. I stood up quickly, water sloshing over the side of the tub, and grabbed a towel. As I hurriedly dried myself, I called Tessa's actual number. She answered on the third ring. "Hey, what's up? I'm at dinner." The background noise confirmed her location. The chatter of other diners, clinking glasses, ambient music. "Did you just call me?" I asked, my voice tight with fear. "No," she replied, sounding confused. "I've been sitting here for the past hour. Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. "I just got a call from your number, but it wasn't you. It was weird, probably a glitch or something. Want me to come home?" she offered, concern evident in her voice. No, I said quickly, not wanting to ruin her evening. "I'm fine. Probably just a crossed line or something. Enjoy your dinner." We hung up and I dressed quickly, abandoning the bath. My mind raced through explanations, phone glitches, caller ID spoofing a cruel prank. But none explained how the caller knew to use that particular phrase, "I'm at the window," a phrase that referenced my deepest fear about the bathroom knocking incident. I moved through the apartment, checking that all windows and doors were locked. When I reached the bathroom, I hesitated before approaching the window. The blackout curtain was still in place, but suddenly it seemed like a flimsy barrier. What if something was just on the other side, waiting? Gathering my courage, I quickly pulled back the curtain, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. There was nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of the walkway beyond. I returned to the living room and sat on the couch, keeping all the lights on. My phone remained clutched in my hand, ready to call 911 if necessary. For nearly an hour, I sat in tense silence, jumping at every creak and rustle from outside. Then, at precisely 10:47 p.m., I remember checking the time on my phone. Every light in the apartment went out simultaneously. The darkness was absolute. Even the streetlights outside seemed to have failed, leaving no ambient glow through the windows. My phone's screen provided the only illumination as I activated the flashlight function with trembling fingers. I knew immediately this wasn't a normal power outage. No storm was forecast, and the abruptness of the blackout, all lights failing at once, rather than the typical flicker before darkness, felt deliberate, targeted. The beam of my phone's flashlight seemed feeble against the overwhelming darkness as I made my way to the kitchen, where we kept emergency candles. I had just located the drawer when I heard it, a soft scratching at the front door, like fingernails dragging lightly across the wood. I froze, flashlight pointed at the door, watching in horror as the handle began to turn slowly. It rotated completely, but the deadbolt prevented the door from opening. The scratching stopped. For several heartbeats, there was complete silence. Then a soft thud against the door, followed by another. It took me a moment to recognize the sound, knuckles rapping gently, in the same pattern I'd heard in the bathroom weeks earlier. 3 distinct knocks. Pause, 3 more. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady despite my racing heart. No response. Just another set of knocks, slightly louder this time. "I've called the police," I lied, my voice stronger now, fueled by adrenaline. "They're on their way." The knocking stopped. I kept the flashlight trained on the door, watching for any movement of the handle. Nothing happened for several long minutes. I began to hope that my bluff had worked, that whatever was out there had left. Then, from the bedroom at the back of the apartment, came the sound of breaking glass. My breath caught in my throat. Someone, or something, was breaking in through my bedroom window. I was trapped between the front door and the intruder entering from the rear of the apartment. In that moment of pure terror, survival instinct took over. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the largest knife from the block, and positioned myself with my back against the wall, where I could see both the hallway leading to the bedroom and the front door. The sound of glass crunching underfoot came from the bedroom, followed by light footsteps moving down the hallway toward me. I raised the knife, preparing to defend myself. The beam of my flashlight, still clutched in my left hand, illuminated the hallway just as a figure stepped into view. What I saw defies easy description. It had a human outline, but the proportions were subtly wrong. Arms slightly too long, neck at an unnatural angle. It wore what appeared to be ordinary clothes, jeans and a dark jacket, but the fabric hung on its frame as if draped over a misshapen mannequin rather than a person. Most disturbing was its face, or rather, the absence of distinct features where a face should be. In the harsh beam of my flashlight, its skin appeared waxy and smooth, with indentations rather than fully formed eyes, nostrils and mouth. Like a sculpture left unfinished, with the basic shape established but details not yet carved. It stood motionless at the end of the hallway, that featureless face turned toward me. Though it had no visible eyes, I felt it studying me with intense focus. "Get out," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Get out now." The thing tilted its head slightly, an eerily human gesture from something so clearly not human. Then, in a voice that was a perfect mimicry of my own, it repeated my words back to me. "Get out. Get out now." My own voice, coming from that incomplete face, broke something in my mind. I lunged forward, knife extended, screaming incoherently. I wasn't thinking clearly, just acting on primal fear and the desperate need to drive this thing away from me. The figure moved with impossible speed, retreating down the hallway and back into the bedroom. I pursued it beyond rational thought now, still screaming and brandishing the knife. When I reached the bedroom doorway, I saw the window, glass indeed broken, curtains fluttering in the night breeze, but no sign of the intruder. I approached cautiously, knife still raised, and peered outside. The ground below my second-floor window was empty. No figure running away, no evidence of someone having jumped or climbed down. It was as if the entity had simply vanished. As I stood there trying to process what had just happened, the lights throughout the apartment suddenly came back on. The abrupt brightness after such intense darkness momentarily blinded me, causing me to stumble backward onto the bed. When my vision cleared, I noticed something on the floor beneath the window, a small white object that hadn't been there before. Moving closer, I realized it was a cat's tooth. I recoiled, dropping the knife in shock. The connection to the white cat I'd seen months earlier was unmistakable. This wasn't random. It was a message, a token left deliberately for me to find. I backed out of the bedroom, unable to take my eyes off the tooth. Once in the hallway, I ran to the front door, needing to escape the confines of the apartment. I fumbled with the deadbolt, finally managing to unlock it and fling the door open. The night air hit me like a physical force, cool and real and normal. The streetlights were functioning, illuminating the empty walkway outside my door. No sign of any intruder, human or otherwise. I stood in the doorway, breathing deeply, trying to calm my racing heart. Had I imagined it all? A hallucination brought on by weeks of stress and paranoia? But the broken window was real, and when I eventually gathered the courage to return to the bedroom, the cat's tooth was still there. Tangible evidence that something had invaded my home. I called Tessa immediately, asking her to come home. While waiting, I called the police, who arrived 20 minutes later. They took my statement and searched the area, but found no sign of an intruder. They suggested the broken window might have been caused by a bird or bat, despite the obvious human-sized opening. Tessa arrived home shortly after the police left. Her face paled as she surveyed the broken window and the disorder of the apartment. "What happened?" she asked, clutching Ash to her chest. The cat seemed agitated, hissing at the bedroom window. I told her everything, not just tonight's events, but all of it. The white cat, the bathroom knocking, the voice calling for help. My research into the disappearances in the 1950s. I showed her the cat's tooth, still lying where I'd found it beneath the window. To my surprise, Tessa didn't dismiss my story as paranoia or imagination. Instead, she sat down heavily on the couch. "I've seen it too," she said quietly. "I just didn't want to scare you." She explained that shortly after we'd moved in 2 years ago, she'd had her own encounters, strange noises outside her window, glimpses of something moving wrongly in the shadows behind our building. She'd convinced herself it was nothing, especially when the incident stopped after a few weeks. "I think it watches people," she said, "studies them, then tries to, I don't know, become them somehow, mimic them." Her admission both validated and terrified me. Whatever this entity was, it had been aware of us, studying us, for much longer than I'd realized. That night, we stayed in a hotel. The next day, we began looking for a new apartment. Within 2 weeks, we had found a place across town and started the process of moving out. During that time, nothing unusual occurred. No strange sightings, no disembodied voices, no white cats. It was as if the entity had achieved whatever purpose our encounter had served and had moved on. The day before our final move, I returned to the old apartment alone to collect the last few items. Tessa had taken Ash to the new place already. The apartment was mostly empty, echoing with that peculiar hollowness of a space no longer lived in. As I gathered the final boxes from my bedroom, I noticed something on the windowsill, something that hadn't been there when I'd arrived. A small white feather, placed precisely in the center of the sill, directly beneath the repaired window. I left it there, closing the door on the apartment and its mysteries for the final time. It's been nearly 9 months since we moved from that apartment near Murder. Our new place is in a busy neighborhood, with plenty of street traffic and lighting, as different from our old location as possible. For the first few months, I jumped at every unusual sound, scrutinized every stranger who moved oddly, checked and rechecked the locks each night. Gradually, that hypervigilance has faded. Tessa and I rarely speak of what happened, though sometimes I catch her watching the street with unusual intensity. I've continued my research in quiet moments, expanding my understanding of mimicry in nature and folklore. I've found no definitive answers, but I've developed theories. Whatever entity stalked us seems to learn through observation and imitation. The white cat may have been an early attempt at creating a form it thought would be non-threatening. The voice on the phone, the knocking, all were attempts to interact using patterns it had observed. The featureless face I saw that final night suggests it's still learning, still perfecting its mimicry. Most disturbing is the thought that it might be getting better at it, that the next person it studies might encounter a more perfect imitation. Still have the newspaper clippings about the disappearances in the 1950s. Sometimes I wonder if those people encountered the entity in a more primitive stage of its learning. Perhaps they saw something so impossible, so utterly wrong, that they couldn't process it, and in that moment of cognitive dissonance became vulnerable. Last week, I was browsing local news when a headline caught my eye. Residents report strange calls for help in riverbed area. The article described incidents just 2 miles from our old apartment. People hearing distress calls at night, followed by sightings of unusual movement in the shadows. I closed the browser and tried to push the information from my mind. It's not my concern anymore. I escaped. I survived. But sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep, I imagine it's still out there, watching from dark corners, learning, adapting, becoming a better mimic with each new subject it studies. And in those moments, I wonder if I truly escaped at all, or if it simply moved on to other, easier targets. Whether the cat's tooth and the feather were warnings, trophies, or invitations, I may never know. What I do know is this: when you sense something watching you from the shadows, when a voice sounds almost but not quite right, when movement in your peripheral vision doesn't follow natural patterns, trust your instincts. The space between what is human and what merely imitates humanity is narrower than we care to admit. And in that narrow space, something is watching, learning, waiting.